Apologize for being a late start by a couple minutes. I welcome you to the Salina City Commission meeting of May 7th, 2018. I have a call to order and a roll call.
Mayor Ryan.
Here.
Commissioner Davis.
Here.
Commissioner Hay.
Here.
Commissioner Hodges.
Here.
Commissioner Hoppick.
Here. We'll have the Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of silence, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Bear with me, I'm a little slow. I've become a left-hander like the prior mayor and the next mayor. Getting used to that. Awards and proclamations, we have some.
Item 3.1, the week of May 6th through 12th, 2018 is National Travel and Tourism Week in the city of Salina. Lyle Parks Convention and Tourism Committee Chair will read the proclamation.
Thank you. Whereas travel has a positive effect on the economic prosperity of the United States, Kansas, Saline County, and Salina, it also impacts business productivity and to individual well-being. Whereas travel to and within the United States provides significant economic benefits, with Saline County visitors spending $197 million in 2015. Whereas travelers' 2015 spending directly generated tax revenues in Saline County of $28.5 million for federal, state, and local governments. Funds used to support essential services and programs. Whereas travel is a pillar of economic growth, creating jobs at a faster rate than other sectors. Whereas travel is among the largest private sector employers in the United States, supporting 8.8 million jobs directly in the travel industry, plus 6.8 million in other industries, and 2,600. That's 1 in every 6 jobs in Saline County. Whereas meetings, events, and incentive travel are core business functions that help companies strengthen business performance, educate employees and customers, and reward business accomplishments. Whereas leisure travel, including youth sports, arts and cultural experiences, reunions, and family travel, accounts for more than 3/4 of all trips taken in the United States, and spurs countless benefits to travelers' health and wellness, creativity, cultural awareness, education, happiness, productivity, and relationships. Whereas welcoming visitors from near and far always has been and always will be the enduring ethos of the travel industry and Salina, Kansas. Whereas this week marks the launch of Destination Salina, a curriculum to orient tourism frontline employees, our ambassadors, to the assets Salina has to offer our visitors. Now therefore I, Carl Ryan, Mayor of Salina, do hereby proclaim May 6 through 12 as National Travel and Tourism Week in Salina, Kansas, and urge the citizens of Salina to join me in the special observance of appropriate events and commemorations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parks. You're looking forward to the launch of Destination Salina. Are there any other events you want us to note?
I'd like to call on Sylvia Rice to come up and fill us in on that.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. And to answer your question, yes, we're very excited about the launch of Destination Salina. This has been a project that's been in the works for some time. It's our first formal attempt at providing a curriculum for frontline employees, and by that I mean hotel desk clerks, housekeepers, wait staff at restaurants, bartenders, retail clerks, all of the people that serve as our ambassadors to visitors when they come to town, to go through a curriculum that we've incentivized along the way and to learn a little bit more about the community so that they can share that information with our visitors when they come in. Beyond the launch of Destination Salina, we have advertising that's running throughout the week that shares kind of a fun theme that the U.S. Travel Association chose for this year's National Travel and Tourism Week, Travel Then and Now. And so make sure you check out the Salina Journal, both in print and online, to see those ads. They're kind of fun. We've pulled some of our favorite tourist attractions in Salina and taken a look at them from a few years ago and from now. For example, one day this week we're featuring what swimming in Salina was like a few years ago and what it's like today. And the same is true of the original street fair with the bicentennial celebration and River Festival today and so forth. So make sure you check those out as well. I will commend Mr. Parks. Part of this Destination Salina program is when you complete a module, it prints you a certificate congratulating you. And he walked into our office today with 4 certificates. He has completed 4 of his modules, and so bravo. Way to represent. I'll call upon the rest of the Visit Salina staff. Kyle Weiser, Tiffany Benin, and Joanne McClure. They have some little gifts for you to celebrate the week with us. And I'm open to any questions if you have any, but otherwise, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. I can't even button my shirt, but I don't know if I could put a pin on, but we'll give it a try. And I have a very nice embossed declaration for you. Is there? I know you collected a number of these at different times, but smile, maybe you'd like to be there. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Everybody's gone through their goodie bag, eh? Okay, we're ready for 3.2.
Item 3.2, the day of May 15th, 2018 is Peace Officers Memorial Day, and the week of May 13th through the 19th, 2018 is Police Week in the city of Salina. Chief Brad Nelson will read the proclamation.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. This starts next Sunday. I think that's why we're doing it today. Whereas the Congress and President of the United States have designated May 15th as Peace Officers Memorial Day in the week in which May 15th falls as National Police Week. And whereas law enforcement officers play an important role in safeguarding the rights, freedoms, safety, and security of the citizens of our communities. And whereas the city of Salina desires to honor the valor, dedication, service, and sacrifice of its own peace officers, 4 of which who have been killed in the line of duty. And whereas 135 officers were killed in the line of duty in 2017, and sadly, 48 have been killed in the line of duty so far this year. Our community joins with other cities and towns to honor all peace officers everywhere. Now, therefore, I, Carl Ryan, Mayor of the City of Salina, do hereby proclaim the week of May 13th to May 19th, 2018 to be Police Week, and call upon all our citizens in this community to especially honor and show our sincere appreciation for the police officers of this city by deed, remark, and attitude. I call upon all our citizens to make every effort to express their thanks to our officers who make it possible for us to leave our homes and families in safety each day and to return to our homes knowing they are protected by officers willing to sacrifice their lives if necessary to guard our loved ones, property, and government against all who would violate the law. Signed this 7th day of May 2018 at the City of Salina, State of Kansas, in the witness thereof, the seal and the signature of the city are affixed.
Thank you very much, Chief Nelson. Are there any other events you'd like to tell us about? That we have an event next Wednesday on the 16th.
There are next Wednesday. I would love for the public to show up. It does mean a lot to the officers when we have a lot of public attendance. It's May 16th, next Wednesday at 8 a.m. at Jerry Ivy Park. If there's inclement weather, it'll be at the First Southern Baptist Church, which is right across the street, but they've graciously allowed us to use their facility if the weather's bad. We have used it in the past, but that's next Wednesday, 8 a.m., Jerry Ivy Park.
Thank you very much. Would you like to accept this proclamation? We're ready for 3.3.
Item 3.3, the week of May 14th through the 20th, 2018 is National Salvation Army Week in the city of Salina. Captain Lynn Lopez, Corps Officer for the Salvation Army, will read the proclamation.
Thank you. To proclaim the week of May 14th, 2018, National Salvation Army Week, whereas the Salvation Army was founded in 1865 by William Booth and arrived in Salina, Kansas in 1897. And whereas the Salvation Army is recognized as an international organization dedicated to preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and to meet human need in his name without discrimination. And whereas Saline County is home to the Salvation Army Corps and Community Center, and whereas the Salvation Army assists more than 5,000 people in need annually in Saline County. Whereas the Salvation Army provides emergency assistance, utility assistance, food assistance, along with a wide variety of other assistance programs. And whereas the Salvation Army Corps and Community Center stands as a venue for all ages and is part of the growing north side of Salina. And whereas the Salvation Army's volunteers, officers, and staff stand ready to help in a time of crisis or disaster, and whereas in 1954 did Kansas' own President Dwight D. Eisenhower declare a National Salvation Army Week for the first time. And whereas, that was all the whereases, now therefore be it resolved. The Salina City Commission does proclaim the week of May 14th, 2018 to be National Salvation Army Week and encourage all citizens to donate or volunteer with the Salvation Army and assist the organization in its ultimate mission of doing the most good. Carl F. Ryan, Mayor.
Thank you very much, Captain. Are there other events you'd like us to know about?
Well, I'd like to mention that during that week, we will be giving tours of our facility so folks can come out and really see what's going on. We have a lot of programs that are up and running and very excited to show those things off. The third Friday of June, we've begun a wave series of Holy Hip Hop. We had over 100 folks, a whole pile of kids that came out and really enjoyed that evening. We had some guests from Oklahoma, Kansas City, and our own local Cache Hollister. It was a lot of fun. So we like folks coming out and seeing things like that.
Well, if you'd like to come up and accept this proclamation. Yep. And you have a lovely facility. I hope people come out and see it. It's a surprise when you get up there and see it. Thanks. Thank you. Next item is citizens forum. If there's anybody that would like to address the commission about any matters that concern them. Thank you.
Joan Ratzlaff, Salina. And I'm here representing the Salina Area Workers Coalition today. I have here a proclamation by the governor of Kansas recognizing Public Service Recognition Week. So it is a national annual event, lasts all week, the first full week in May every year, been since, I think, 1986. And in the past, on occasion, city or county commissions have also, had some kind of a proclamation, but I didn't see one coming this year, so I'm going to read this one from the governor. And, I want to recognize Senator Hardy for helping to communicate to the governor's office to obtain this. So, State of Kansas proclamation by the governor. To the people of Kansas, greetings. Whereas Kansans are served every single day by public servants at the federal, state, county, and city levels. These unsung heroes do the work that keeps our nation working. And whereas public employees take not only jobs, but oaths, and whereas many public servants, including military personnel, police officers, firefighters, and healthcare professionals, risk their lives each day in service to the people of Kansas. And whereas public servants include teachers, doctors, scientists, nurses, safety inspectors, sanitation workers, laborers, water plant workers, computer technicians, social workers, countless other occupations who consistently provide the diverse services needed by Kansans of their government with efficiency and integrity. And whereas, without these dedicated public servants at every level, continuity would be impossible in a democracy that changes its leaders and elected officials. Now, therefore, I, Jeff Collier, MD, Governor of the State of Kansas, do hereby recognize May 6th through May 12th, 2018, as Public Service Recognition Week in Kansas, and I call on all citizens to recognize the accomplishments and contributions of Kansas government employees at all levels. And signed by the governor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'll look to our staff and say, you know, we really appreciate the good things that you do, and so opportunity to say thank you.
Karen Shade. I also am part of the Workers' Coalition, but that's not why I'm here before you today. But I would encourage you to formally recognize your staff. I hope HR has got something wonderful planned, and I hope all supervisors recognize those who they supervise. So I'm here to talk about construction on Santa Fe. I emailed City Manager Jason Gage my concerns on April 28th. I was delayed in getting here a week. Not much has changed, so it seems to still be relevant. Salina seems to have a lot of drivers who have vehicle dysmorphic disorder. They think they can park extended vehicles in parking space designed for compact cars. It's been common for City Go buses traveling down Santa Fe from Ash to Mulberry to encounter 2 to 5 vehicles extending from their parking spot every time they come down Santa Fe. In the past, the City Go drivers have slowed and stopped and waited for traffic in the second lane to clear before they drove the bus around the extending vehicle. Now heavy traffic occupies the second lane. In my opinion, parking enforcement has been delinquent in addressing this issue. Now traffic flow is impeded and a possible safety hazard exists in that fire engines, utility trucks, and similar vehicles can easily go up and down Santa Fe. I'd like to see parking enforcement issue summons of inconsideration to these drivers and plaster a City of Salina certified road hog bumper sticker on their vehicle. There are other creative ways to get the message across, but towing vehicles away may be necessary. The construction has already forced the closure of a City Go bus stop at Santa Fe and Mulberry. That means for me, 2 to 3 times a month, this fat old lady has to hoof it from Assurance Partners at Iron and Train Tracks to 7th and Walnut. I get grumpy when I see relatively few workers productively accomplishing tasks. If I have to hoof it, then I think those drivers of extended vehicles should have to hoof it a half a block and park off Santa Fe. Today's problematic road hog, or this goes back a week. Last Monday, the problematic road hog was a blue Jeep station wagon, license plate 544 ECI or 1. I'll be happy to come back each week and give you a list of the other road hogs. But I'm hoping that both law enforcement or the police department and parking enforcement is a part of them will address these issues. The other thing that's missing, I heard other people another presentation talk about keeping the public informed on changes, and I'm not seeing that happening in the driving zone. I watch lanes that are supposed to be blocked, no left turn, and watch routinely people make those left turns. And there are other things that just don't make sense. And I would just encourage that it's time to promote conversation about what's going on, because you don't want people getting grumpy and choosing not to go downtown.
Thank you very much. Okay. It would be news to me, I guess, if the length of the vehicle was part of the ordinance. Is that?
Yeah, there's no restriction. I don't know in modern times if there ever has been a restriction on the length of the vehicle in the parking spot. We'll have to look. I think I forwarded that over to Public Works to take a look at that. But you're going to have somebody down there enforcing probably all the time. And that's the other thing. If you're going to see, you often see in traffic where you have diverted traffic and changes in the traffic for projects set up, you're going to see some people who are not going to follow. And there's times you're going to have patrol, and we'll talk about how often we need patrol there, but you can't afford to have patrol there all the time. So there will still be times where somebody might try to do something they're not supposed to do. So we'll need to look at that. But I don't know if there's any flexibility in the area that's taken for construction activities could free up a little more space. That would may or may not be easier than trying to deal with vehicles over X length and telling them basically you can't come downtown, because that's the other thing. If we're worried about people being frustrated, we can give them a lot of reasons to be frustrated. That would be one of them. I don't know which one gives you the highest volume of folks at this point.
There may not be an ordinance against the length of the vehicle, but imagine we have one about a vehicle that's parked blocking the active lane.
Yeah, but you would still have, in this situation, typically before the construction, you've always had 2 lanes going in a single direction. So the second lane, while practically you might look at it and say, well, there's at least another place for a vehicle to go, technically a car could still block the 1 lane.
Well,
the difference is there's a different impact today if there isn't a place, if there's not room to go around that.
Right, and I've came out of First Bank, Kansas, and literally watched a city go bus have to sit there literally for 4 minutes until the driver of the truck could be. There was no space to go around the back of that long pickup truck. The
Yeah.
construction cones came over too close.
I think we're going to have to, and this will be something that Jim will have to talk with the contractors and have a discussion, because I think possibly you could create more frustration and more issue by trying to somehow regulate the length of a vehicle in there and try to limit it versus to try to create
Not
more
so much
space.
regulating the length of the vehicle, but regulating any vehicle blocking the active driving
Well,
lane.
you would have to regulate the length of the vehicle. You'd have to basically say, if your vehicle's X length or longer, we know it doesn't fit, don't park there, in order to do that, because they're extending out in because they're long. I mean, that's what's caused them to block. I doubt that it's because they're not parked all the way in,
Well,
but
right,
I don't know.
because in that way, you don't even have to specify the length of the vehicle. If your vehicle, whatever it is, blocks the 1 driving lane we have left, park someplace else.
Yeah, that's, you're asking people to think a little bit more.
Well, they don't
No matter-
have to. They could come out and find their vehicle towed, but
They may look at it and say, I didn't think I was going to block the lane of traffic. And so that also depends on the width of the vehicle and the driving lane that's going to pass by behind them as well. If you're in a smart car, it's a little different than if you're in a City Go bus as well. So I don't want to make a quick presumption about what we need to do on the fly, because we'll be wrong more than once if we do that. I think we really need to take a look at it and see. But I just believe that if there's and I don't know if this if is a possibility, if we can work with them on creating more space, it's going to be a whole lot easier than basically saying you can't block, which means from the curb when you park out, we can already tell you about what length the vehicle is going to take to get you into that situation, and try to enforce that on a daily and hourly, maybe every 10-minute basis or something.
Yeah.
I agree it's an issue. If it's too long, we have to figure something out.
The one thing I heard today is it's not come before the council. It's past time, in my opinion, for it to have come to the council. You just need to be aware that with any step forward, a positive step forward with making the improvements and putting in the sewer, there's going to be some small things that, City Go buses would probably have plans to avoid downtown at certain points. I'm not so concerned about them, but it really does. The flow of traffic, when you're talking emergency vehicles having to get up and down, what if the emergency is in the construction zone? There has to be something there. And so my point of view is it's just past time to be having these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just had one quick follow-up to that. HDR does provide an educational component within our contract, correct, in terms of helping to keep the public informed, and I think that as we reach a solution to that, whether or not it looks like restricting length, or talking about impeding lanes, or parallel parking, or I'm just throwing things out here. I think that might be something nice to visit with HDR about, because I know that they were talking about their efforts to help get a lot of recognition out in terms of where people could and couldn't park during construction, so that businesses would be impacted as little as possible.
Yeah, I think we, under contract, the general contractor actually has the assigned person for that. Certainly, we always look to HDR for some assistance as well. Ideally, if you can, we'd say park in the rear and you don't have that situation. Now, there are going to be some of those rear parking spaces, if you have a long vehicle, you might have a hard time getting in and out as well. So I don't know if that creates an issue, but it certainly doesn't in a driving lane, which would take priority. So we'll take a look at all those options and see. I don't really think anyone really anticipated that being an issue going in. But we do need to make sure that, especially for public safety vehicles, that you don't have to stop and wait, because that's not a good wait.
Okay. Other comments? Thank you. Item 5, public hearings and items scheduled for a certain time. We have none. We'll move
We've got one
more.
sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Judy Larson, Salina. I am City Go's favorite passenger. And I wish each of you would ride a City Go bus, maybe 3 or 4 times in a week. Prescott and Ohio. By the end of the week, you'll slit your wrist. This is ridiculous. It's not being addressed, it's not safe, and there are just 100 reasons why the city commission should pay more attention to the people that are traveling on the road. Because you will sit there until, I'm not going to say what I was going to say, but it's just ridiculous. You can spend 5-10 minutes waiting to get on Ohio. This is wrong. And it's a waste of time, it's a waste of energy, and you know, when I mention this to people, they say, oh, yeah. Well, yeah. You know, I have better things to do at my time than wait to get on Ohio. And I think if you thought about it and addressed it and rode the bus a couple times, you go nuts. We need to do this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. That was actually really good advice to get out and ride the bus. And I think also to maybe get out in some other parts of the community that you're not normally in, like North Salina. My name is John Blanchard. I live at 1117 State Street. One thing I want to talk to you guys about was a vote that you took last week, or let me restate that, 2 weeks ago, your last regular meeting in regards to the training facility for the Salina Police Department. And in particular, I want to talk about Representative Clays and the offer that he, I thought, very graciously and articulated quite well about the opportunity to consolidate and work together with KHP, which wasn't really an option that had been on the table before I think Commissioner Hodges had brought that up. I really thought that probably it sounded at the time that Commissioner Hay would be in the majority to work on that, and I appreciate the mayor and Commissioner Hodges' willingness to look at taxpayer funds critically and weigh urgency against duplication of funds and services and the possibility of losing this training facility if we don't do everything within our power to fully secure that facility. But going back to Representative Clays, I thought, as I said, that he very clearly laid out a path forward that would be possible on that facility. And so after that vote was taken, I met with him out in the cafeteria over here and had a nice conversation. I encouraged him to be open to kind of giving me updates and sharing back and forth progress with anything, because I still think that there are questions about whether or not you'll actually even get that into the building phase this year. You still have quite a few hurdles, planning and otherwise, to work through, property acquisitions and so on. So I'll cut to the chase here, and I had sent him an email and said, you know, any further ideas on where consolidation might be possible, and got a response back to him that he actually had put in a request for the Vertra simulator in the KHP budget for $250,000, and it is likely that that would be secured and signed into action this week by the governor. It's likely that he said here that the overall budget would be $350 on that, but that other funding sources would take care of the additional costs, which would likely go to some of the different components that would go along with the simulator. He also had added that they would be required to purchase it, since it would be included in the 2018 budget, would be required to purchase it prior to July 1st of this year. I think one of the things that I took away from Representative Clays was the fact that we're in a state that obviously has budget considerations that are very tight. I think increasingly we have that, and we see that at the local level as well, and I think we need to take every opportunity that we can to work with not only the state and KHP, but also the county on finding creative solutions. And I think, as I said last time, I fully support the need for this facility, but I want to also fully support those of you that feel like it's worthy to look at that, and that it's more than worthy. I think it's the responsible thing to do. So in closing on that, I'd like to thank you guys for hearing my comments on this, and I would just like to, you can consult with your parliamentarian, but the three of you that did vote in favor of this, knowing the new information that you do have now, and the ability, being this the first regular meeting after your action, you do have the opportunity to make a motion to reconsider. I would urge you to do that, to at least have a full and open discussion about what this may or may not mean. And the motion to reconsider and the discussion and the retaking of a vote does not mean that you don't end up in the same place with the 3-2 against, but I think that it gives you an opportunity to fully discuss a change in the landscape that may be possible here. So I thank you very much.
Thank you. And I would just look to Mr. Bringston as if there was some of the commissioners that voted for that item and wanted to reconsider. Would the appropriate place for that be to bring that up under other business as a motion to reconsider? And if we don't, we won't.
Yeah, that certainly would be, Mayor. I think that would probably be the best place for that to occur if anyone is inclined that way.
Mull that over then. Thank you. We'll move on. Is there anyone else that wanted to address the commission? We'll move on to the consent agenda, please.
Item 6.1, approve the minutes of April 23rd, 2018. Item 6.2, approve resolution number 18-7553, appointing members to the library board. Item 6.3, authorize the mayor to accept the offered public utility easement dedication from FIB LLC relating to the Downtown Alley Entertainment Center project. And item 6.4, authorize the mayor to accept the offered sanitary sewer easement dedication from Lighthouse Properties 3 Incorporated relating to the Downtown Hotel project.
Are there any items on the consent agenda that any commissioner would like to remove? If there are none, I'd accept a motion to approve.
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. All those in favor of approving the consent agenda as presented, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We will pass those 4 items and move on to administration. 7.1.
Item 7.1, second reading, ordinance number 18-10933, amending Chapter 35, Article 12, Sections 35-261, 35-262, 35-264, 35-266, 35-268, and 35-270 to clarify the rights and responsibilities under the Sidewalk Cafe license agreements approved in the downtown area.
This is a second reading. I'm not aware that we've had any public comment on this item. Is there any comment from the public here today? Anything that the staff wanted to add to this item? If not, we'll bring it back up here for action. Is there a motion for this second reading?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded that we approve this ordinance number 1. Well, I'm not going to read them all. Leave that to the clerk. And we have a roll call, please.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Hay?
Aye.
Commissioner Hodges?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick?
Aye.
Mayor Ryan?
Aye. That passes 5-0. Downtown Hotel, 7.2.
Item 7.2, Downtown Hotel, 7.2A, second reading ordinance number 17-10912, ordering the vacation of a portion of a north-south alley located on the block bordered by East Mulberry Street on the south, South Santa Fe Avenue on the west, East Walnut Street on the north, and South Fifth Street on the east. And 7.2B, resolution number 18-7554, pursuant to Salina Code Section 42-63A, authorizing the issuance of a permit for construction of footing and foundation for the downtown hotel project, subject to conditions.
This also is a second reading. Are there any, I don't believe we've had any input this last period of time. Anything from the public? Bring it back up here for discussion. Is there any discussion necessary for the second reading? And okay. Oh, please come up.
I'm sorry for the interruption, but, Judy Larson, Salina. They know that I come to the commission meetings, and I get a lot of requests about this hotel. Where is it? You know, how many people, how many rooms, how many whatever. So if you could give me that information so I could pass it along to all these inquiries that I get, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
You have an aerial photo. I think Mr. Hers has an aerial photo that he can put up, although it's dated from the fact that the buildings depicted are no longer there. But just by way of background, the project that this alley vacation is intended to make way for is the construction of a 5-story hotel that it would occupy this block and extend from Santa Fe over to Fifth Street. There's a north-south alley that comes through here. That alley has sanitary sewer and other utilities in it. All of the utilities have been relocated to date, which is why we are here today, except for Ms. Tasker's sanitary sewer, which is still in place and still in operation. That will be addressed. But the plan is that there's a hotel to be constructed here. It will be 5 stories, have 113 rooms. There will be a building attached to it off to the side that will house a restaurant and retail space, and then there will be conference room space and some other amenities for the hotel on the back side. There will be some parking up here to the north, and a number of these structures here have been removed to make way for satellite parking that will be on the east side of Fifth Street. So the item that's before you was passed on first reading December 4th, 2017, and the City Commission put 3 stipulations on the vacation of the alley. One was that the petitioner make satisfactory financial arrangements with the public and franchise utilities who are in the alley, and they have done that. The only line, as I noted, not yet physically relocated is the sanitary sewer. Petitioner must execute a transfer agreement with the City of Salina for the hotel project, which has been done. And the petitioner must dedicate all public utility easements needed to accommodate the relocated public and franchise utilities. And with the item that was on your consent agenda was the final piece of the puzzle to allow this north-south sewer to be relocated over to this alley here. And so all those have been satisfactorily addressed, so this has been brought back for second reading. What has been changed or modified is that the ordinance as presented now reserves a temporary utility easement, and that is to allow the sanitary sewer line that is still in place there to remain in service. And then the item that's been added to your agenda is a resolution that you, the city commission, would authorize a footing and foundation permit to move forward while that line was still in service on a temporary basis, and then when all the relocation was complete, that temporary easement would be abandoned. But it's a question of timing in terms of the need to start installing and having the concrete cure for the footings and the timing of getting the sewer relocated. So this presents two questions for you. One is approving an ordinance vacating the alley on second reading and reserving a temporary utility easement. And then part two would be the attached resolution with authorizes staff to issue a permit for construction of footing and foundation for the hotel project. I don't know, did that give you enough description of what and where the hotel is? Okay.
Thank you.
So,
Questions for Mr. Andrews?
so it's a two-part action item. One would be the final action on the ordinance that would make the alley disappear, but would retain a temporary easement. And the part two would be your authorization to allow footings and foundations to be placed in that temporary easement area under the supervision of Ms. Tasker. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments from the builder or the applicants on this? Don't know that any are necessary, but
Don Booz,
there were conditions.
500 Graves Boulevard. We're just very excited to keep moving. This is quite a process. There's quite a bit of moving pieces. Dean mentioned the footings foundation. The buildings can actually sit on piers. There's 286 auger cast pilings that are going to go into the ground, somewhere around 40 feet, 60 feet into the ground. So quite a bit, be really an exciting project. And so we appreciate the support of the commission and staff. We worked together on the sanitary sewer easement. I think it was one of the private utilities that indicated it would have been easier for them to have an easement on the south side of the lots to the south of Mulberry, and so we dedicated that or presented the information. And then Martha indicated she was going to take advantage of that and come out to 5th Street and come over instead of tearing up as much of Mulberry. And then we thought, well, gosh, if you're ultimately going to connect to that alley between 5th and 4th, we'll give another easement on the south side of Mulberry, and you don't have to destroy Mulberry. So it saved time and it saved money just working together, and that's just how things should be, and it's exciting to see it take place. So we're always happy to be here and share any information we have.
Any questions? Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any comments from the public on this item? We'll bring it back up here for action on the second reading. Is there a motion for the second reading of the ordinance?
Mr. Mayor, I'll make a motion that we approve on second reading ordinance number 17-10912.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. We'll have a roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Hay?
Aye.
Commissioner Hodges?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick?
Aye.
Mayor Ryan?
Aye. On resolution number 187554, do we have a motion for the resolution?
Mr. Mayor, I make a motion we adopt resolution number 18-7554, authorize insurance of a permit for construction of a footing and foundation for the downtown hotel projects subject to conditions.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes 5-0 as well. We'll move on to 7.3.
Item 7.3, second reading ordinance number 18-10927, vacating a portion of a 115 feet wide utility easement on Lot 1, Block 12 of the Schilling subdivision number 5.
This is a second reading. As far as I know, there's been no additional information or comment come to the commission. Is there any other input from the staff or the public? Bring this back to us, is there any discussion, or is there a motion for the item?
I do just want to note for the record that the 3 preconditions have been satisfactorily addressed by the petitioner, per city staff. So at any rate, in case anyone watching at home was wondering about that, the 3 conditions have been met. And I would move that we approve ordinance number 18-10927 on second reading.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Do we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Hay?
Aye.
Commissioner Hodges?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick?
Aye.
Mayor Ryan?
Aye. That passes 5-0. 7.4.
Item 7.4, award contract for the downtown sanitary sewer relocations, project number 63162.
Ms. Tasker.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. As a part of the downtown improvements, I've heard quite a bit about that already today in reference to the hotel. The second location in my project includes the entertainment center that's located on Ash Street between Santa Fe and Fifth Street. In both of these cases, the proposed building was going to span over a platted public alley. And in this case, the existing sewer lines will be relocated, and then the existing line will be abandoned in place, which will allow us to vacate that platted public alley. The hotel sewer relocation is roughly 380 linear feet of 12-inch gravity sewer. As I mentioned, the easements are in private property at no cost to our project. And on the entertainment center, there's roughly 465 linear feet of 8-inch sewer. In that case, the easements are on private property, no cost to the project, and in the Fifth Street right-of-way. When the field house was constructed, we extended that sewer line across Ash Street to avoid that traffic issue in the future. So that line is stubbed out and ready to connect on for the Alley Entertainment Center. We had 4 contractors asked for plans for this project. We had 1 bid from Stevens Contractors Incorporated in the amount of $243,595. The engineer's estimate was $378,925. Staff has compared Stevens Contractors' bid to our engineer's estimate in previous bids. We compared with the field house, the South Ohio project, and then these 2 projects. The field house was kind of on the high level of estimates. South Ohio was on the lower end, and these numbers fall right in the middle and match up very reasonably close as far as the pipe and for the engineer's estimate. Most of the additional cost was in manholes and auxiliary items, not necessarily the pipe, which is typically the largest cost of your project. Based on that, we believe that Stevens' bid is, we called it justifiable or reasonable. We struggled with the right word there, but we think it's a good bid for this project. Stevens has completed several projects for us. Their work has been satisfactory, in most cases excellent customer service. So we feel very comfortable with them doing this project in the downtown area where traffic control and dealing with the public will be complicated in line with the downtown water project and streetscape. So a lot of detours and things to think about as we do this project. The hotel sanitary sewer will be complete by July 7th. And as I mentioned, I'm the last holdout, and part of that has to do with we were looking for more cost-effective ways to construct this project, and we just kept making slight improvements, and Don spoke to those. So we avoid removing all the brick in Mulberry and replacing those. So this was a nice cost savings for that piece of the project. The entertainment center will be complete by September 7th of this year, which is well ahead of their construction and their project. So we've coordinated with their designer on time, schedule, and locations of the sewer. So feel like we're on track with them. In our Water and Wastewater Capital Reserve Fund, we budgeted $425,000 for this project. And so based on the numbers you can see, we're very well in line with that. And staff is proposing an additional 10% construction contingency to be approved to allow us to make minor changes during construction. In the event we have any changes that would be over and above this 10% or a change in scope, we bring those back to the City Commission for your approval. Staff recommends that the City Commission award the contract for downtown sanitary sewer relocation, project number 63162, to Stevens Contractors Incorporated of Salina, Kansas, in the amount of $243,595. The authorized amount with the 10% contingency would be $267,955. I'd be glad to answer any questions you may have.
Questions for Ms. Tasker? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is anyone in the public that would like to address this item? Commissioners, is there discussion or a motion on this item?
Motion, I move that we award the contract for the downtown sanitary sewer relocations, project number 63162, to Stevens Contractors Incorporated of Salina, Kansas, in the amount of $243,595 with a 10% construction contingency, bringing the total to $267,955.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
That was 4-1, 1 nay. Development business, 8.1.
Item 8.1, first reading, ordinance number 18-10934, approving an amendment of the future land use map of the Salina, Kansas Comprehensive Plan to change the future land use designation of the southwest corner of North Ohio Street and Johnstown Avenue from future urban residential to future commercial.
8.1, we'll hear from Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mayor and Commissioners. These next two agenda items deal with essentially the northwest corner of North Ohio Street and Iron Avenue, but extending up to Johnstown. And the area in question is the request area that you see on the screen, and it consists of 4 properties that are located directly north of the intersection of Iron and Ohio. These properties are or were occupied by residential dwellings and were zoned single-family residential. And Mr. Brian Richardson has a contract. He has successfully acquired 2 properties, has a contract to purchase a third, and is negotiating to purchase a 4th property at the southwest corner of North Ohio Street and Johnstown Avenue. And his plan is to clear that site and incorporate roughly 32,000 square feet into a commercial redevelopment site on the west side of Ohio that would extend from Iron Avenue on the south to Johnstown on the north. And so this is actually, if you could go stay with the future land use map, Dustin, the colored map. Okay, so this is the area in question, and so this is all one platted lot in Surveyor's Plat 12. The south 150 feet of that is Zone C5 and is shown as commercial on the future land use map. The north 168 feet is zoned R1 single-family residential and is shown as future urban residential on the land use map. And so through Santa Fe Properties, Mr. Richardson has filed this application to change the future land use designation for the north parcel from urban residential to commercial. And the reason for this is to support a companion application to change the zoning classification of the properties at 115, 119, and 123 North Ohio. And so the applicant is requesting that the City Commission approve an expansion of the commercial land use area at Iron and Ohio by 168 feet to the north up to Johnstown Avenue. And as justification for the change, the applicant points out that this intersection, the corner of Iron and Ohio, has remained vacant for 14 years, and the Iron and Ohio intersection is in need of new investment. In his opinion, the lots in Ohio are not a desirable location for residential dwellings due to the high volume of traffic and the other commercial development in the vicinity. There are really no other sites along Ohio Street that are suitable for this type of commercial redevelopment. So we have summarized for you in the packet the current urban residential land use designation and what it entails. And we would point out that as a secondary use, it does identify convenience retail and service. However, it does not, in its potential zoning districts, list any zoning districts that would allow for that type of development, and that is the reason for the commercial land use designation request. And so the applicant's plan is to develop a mixed-use center of retail service and office space that would primarily serve the surrounding neighborhood, including the Norton Apartments on East Iron, which are in the process of being renovated. So on page 4 of our report, we summarize for you the primary uses under the commercial land use category, and they are retail and service, office, and civic and institutional uses, and C5 is included as a potential zoning district. One of the things we did for you is looked at the traffic counts, and the intersection carries nearly 16,000 cars a day between Iron and Ash, and 17,000 per day south of Iron. There's actually more traffic on Iron east of Ohio than there is west of Ohio. And all 4 corners are shown as commercial and have been shown as commercial in some form since 1977. There has been one expansion of the commercial area at this intersection. That was done in 1998, and that was to allow a car wash expansion at the Green Lantern, now Casey's convenience store. And so also on page 4, we have summarized for you the square footages at each of the 4 corners. And so Taco Bell site has nearly 40,000 square feet, which is a little less than an acre. The northwest corner is smaller than that. It's currently 29,000 square feet. The Dower Truck Sales site is the smallest at 15,000 square feet, and the site of Casey's is 54,000 square feet. If the applicant's request is approved, it would expand the commercial land use area up to 61,800 square feet, the largest area at the intersection. So some of the factors that you are to look at when considering an amendment is whether the amendment is justified by changing conditions, whether it advances goals and policies contained in the plan, if there's a public need for changing the map, whether the public need is best served by changing the land use designation at the site in question, and whether the change would negatively impact surrounding property. So the urban residential land use designation is intended to encourage and allow for higher density residential development, but it also allows for convenience retail service as a secondary use in certain locations, but it does not include C5 as a potential zoning classification. And so the request that's before you is doesn't necessarily result in a use that wouldn't be anticipated here, but it does result in a change in order to support the change to C5. So I was going to just read a couple excerpts from the urban residential land use category, and it says that convenience, retail, and service should occur at concentrated nodes, that is intersections of collector streets or higher classification, and Iron, Ohio would meet that. They should be no greater than 5 acres in area, and this would meet that. They may be shifted to one quadrant or centered on all 4 quadrants of an intersection. No more than 30,000 square feet of non-residential space should be allowed total. Design should strive to complement and enhance the existing character of surrounding uses and neighborhoods. So all of those are spelled out. The only thing that's lacking in the urban residential land use category is the ability to have a zoning district that allows that type of development. And so that the case or the question here is for you to decide whether this area is more closely related to the urban residential area to the west and north, or whether you feel this is more closely related to the commercial area at the intersection. The Planning Commission had a public hearing on this request at their April 17th meeting, and at the conclusion of the meeting, they voted 7-0 to recommend this change to the future land use plan, and they made 7 findings in support of their recommendation, and those are on page 5 and 6 of your report. And their first finding was that the northwest corner of Iron, Ohio has remained vacant and undeveloped since the filling station on the property was removed in 2004. The condition of the homes facing Ohio Street has continued to deteriorate. The south, the property is 319 feet from north to south, and only the south 150 feet is zoned commercial, and this is insufficient land area for a meaningful commercial redevelopment of the area. The request is a logical expansion of an existing commercially zoned area. All of the property included in the request area faces and is accessible from Ohio Street. The applicant's request would still limit commercial development on Ohio Street to this concentrated node at the intersection, which is encouraged in the comprehensive plan and would not result in strip commercial development, which is discouraged in the plan. This planned commercial redevelopment would be infill development, and it would be reinvestment in an area of change, which is encouraged in the comprehensive plan. The expansion of commercial services would complement efforts to redevelop the nearby Norton apartment buildings, and the urban residential land use category, which its present classification does allow convenience, retail, and service as a secondary land use, but does not list C5 as a potential zoning district. So this is a question about the future land use map, and so if you concur with the recommendation and findings of the Planning Commission, the attached ordinance that changes the future land use designation should be approved on first reading. If you disagree with the recommendation of the Planning Commission, you could make and approve a motion to either deny the land use plan amendment or to send this back to the Planning Commission. If you reaffirm the existing future land use map, then the current boundary would remain in place as it is along Ohio Street, and that would be as reflected on this map. So this is the existing commercial land use area, and the request is to expand it to incorporate these properties there. So with that, I'd be open to any questions you have. I do believe Mr. Richardson's here as well if you have questions of him. But this is not the question of zoning. This is whether the plan should be amended to support a change to commercial zoning.
Questions for Mr. Andrews?
I just have a couple. Just in looking through the comp plan and the different categories that are available, and first of all, let me just start off by saying absolutely I'm excited about this plan. I just have some questions in terms of the process, I guess, that are more related to the comp plan. my question is, right now it's urban residential. When we were looking at the Popeyes chicken restaurant at the corner of Crawford and Ohio, that is a neighborhood center, correct?
Correct.
Was there any consideration toward, instead of just blowing right through to, commercial, that we would maybe consider this node, or whatever it's called in the comp plan, more of something in the neighborhood center?
It was discussed, and there was some discussion about, a lot of discussion in Ohio and Iron. There actually is a neighborhood center in the vicinity, but it starts at Indiana and runs from Indiana to Iowa along East Iron. And so the consultants who helped develop the plan thought that was more, because it had some apartments and some other things, they thought it was more typical of a neighborhood center than this particular intersection that had commercial on 3 hard corners. The other item that was discussed was possibly extending the neighborhood center from Iowa and Indiana all the way down Iron to Ohio, and essentially having from Ohio over to Iowa along Iron as a neighborhood center. But it was discussed that this could possibly be another neighborhood center, but their preference or their recommendation was to designate the area essentially starting at Indiana and Iron and extending over to Iowa along Iron as a neighborhood center.
I guess when I start to look at the location, in terms of the comp plan, how does the designation, the category, relate to impact streets and gateways? Because when I look at the map, this is obviously, we just invested a whole bunch of money in making Iron an impact street, and that's one of the gateways that's identified going into downtown. Would a neighborhood center category designation help in any way with making sure that our gateway and complete street standards are upheld?
It would. From a logistical and application standpoint, just to put it clearly, the belief from the consultants at the time was that they were going to do the comp plan as phase 1, and then they were going to get hired to rewrite our zoning ordinance to match up with the ordinance, which did not occur. So we told them in the interim that they needed to carefully tie these land use categories back to our existing zoning categories. And that is one thing that is not done strongly. And so my example would be, and you've got it in your packet, and it's page 210 in the comprehensive plan, and it's the category for urban residential. And it has this classification of convenience, retail, and service. And we had this discussion in the case of the relocation of a beauty and nail salon from where the CVS pharmacy is to the corner of Greeley and Ohio. And so that was shown as urban residential, and the beauty salon was clearly a convenience, retail, and service. But if you go down to the potential zoning districts that are identified in that category, not a single one of those districts allows convenience, retail, and service. So that's something that we have tried to amend on a couple of occasions, and not successfully. But the other side of this is then if you go, and we did not include it in your packet, but in the neighborhood center category, a case could be made to take this whole intersection and make it a neighborhood center. But in the context of Popeyes, we pointed out that 95% of the Crawford, Ohio Neighborhood Center is Zone C5. However, the Planning Commission was willing, but the City Commission was unwilling to make C5 a potential zoning district in the neighborhood center. So, if that is an alternative to go from urban residential to neighborhood center, but it would then create an additional step of changing the request here from C5, the maximum zoning district that's allowed in a neighborhood center is C3, and it must be planned C3, and that could be done, but essentially if you were to say as an alternative to urban residential that it be changed from neighborhood center, then the zoning item that is a companion with this, the C5 being requested, would not be consistent with the neighborhood center, and that would need to be modified as well. So there's a way to get there, but it's not a straight line.
Whatever. What are the differences between C3 and C5 zonings? What's
the primary distinctions that we always describe is that C5 allows for outdoor type uses that have outdoor display. So anything that's in C3 is retail that's inside a building. You cannot do a used car lot in C3. You can do a used car lot in C5. And so there was and is no longer some C5 zoning on East Iron in that Iowa and Indiana corridor. The City Commission downzoned that from C5 to C3 because they didn't want to allow for car lots or uses that had outdoor storage. And the same was done on South Ohio, where areas zoned C5 were downzoned to C3, again to eliminate outdoor display and outdoor storage. So the primary distinction between C3 and C5 is that C5 allows for a little greater lot coverage, it allows for greater building height, and the main difference is that everything in C3 is supposed to be inside a building, and in C5 you can have outdoor display, outdoor storage.
Gotcha. So would the plan as presented, the rendering as presented, I mean, I didn't see anything that was outdoor storage. I mean, it looked primarily like, retail. So would that, I mean, is that compatible with a C3?
The plan as presented, as we've reviewed it, would fit the uses, the design, everything would fit within C3 parameters. What we worked with the applicant on was that we had C5 zoning at 4 corners there, and given that he had a property he owned that was already zoned C5, it seemed logical to build on that. But that was the same thing at the Popeye site. We started out with C5 and we ended up with PC3. So that is still within the realm of possibility and would allow for the project. It's not a straight line.
In terms of a straight line too, I just have one last question. What triggers the reevaluation of the comp plan with the future land use map? I mean, is that something where if somebody, say, decides that they, that they're interested in putting a business, say, in my neighborhood or something that would affect my property, they don't have to have my permission to make a request on changing the land use map, or yes, and do we have, have all the property owners signed off on this particular change for the land use map?
I can't say that they have signed off on it. They have been notified of it. They received a letter in the mail. We had a couple of those owners at the Planning Commission hearing. They did not speak, they just observed, but we did not receive any formal feedback on that. But as a matter of our process, in this case, Mr. Richardson expressed a desire to attempt to expand the C5 zoning. We identified that this area that he's requesting is not of a land use category, so step one is always to look at whether a plan amendment is justified as the first step, and then the zoning becomes the second step. But we would not change the future land use designation of a neighborhood or an area without notification and a public hearing.
Other questions for Mr. Andrews? Would the applicant like to address us?
Mayor, Commissioners, I'm Brian Richardson, 361 North Holmes Road. Thanks for the opportunity to share. I do appreciate Dean's help on this project, and certainly am just willing to answer any questions. I think he gave great detail, so be glad to answer that you might have.
Questions for Mr. Richardson?
I just appreciate the investment that you're making in the 2 apartment buildings and at that intersection as well. And I just want to do everything that we can to make sure that you know, we get the best product that we can, and I know you're committed to that as well. So thank you very much for making the reinvestment in the older buildings and in the core. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anyone like to comment on this item to the commission? Bring it back up here for discussion. Is there further discussion?
We've got one.
Oh, excuse me, Mr. Blanchard.
Hi, yeah,
Go
John
ahead.
Blanchard, 1117 State Street. I attended the Planning Commission meeting on that, and of course, I have something on the rezoning, but I'll wait till that comes up. But just a couple of things on the land use component of this thing. I think it'd be very helpful for not only yourselves and staff, but developers as well, if we kind of filled in that blank space that exists between land use and zoning on that. And I think, Jason, you know what I'm talking about on that. Dean mentioned you have a urban residential land use designation without the zoning to go along with it to help implement the visions of your comp plan. I think when you look at neighborhood center and commercial, your commercial designation land area-wise is so out of scale with what that actual area is that that piece of property there is sort of in a black hole of, it doesn't really fit into any category, but it fits most closely into either neighborhood center or urban residential. So I would encourage you, and Jason and I had had numerous conversations about how the comp plan and the zoning ordinances don't quite match up, and we needed to get that there, but never quite were able to get that to happen. The Popeyes is a perfect example. So as far as the land use goes, I echo Commissioner Hodges on this thing. The infill portion is great. The redevelopment portion is great. It's in a really nice neighborhood. I think it really has a neighborhood feel to it. You really need to be concerned about, and one thing that I don't agree with the recommendations, I would support, at the Planning Commission did and would continue to support the project. But I would say that I'm concerned that it's a building in the middle of a parking lot. And it's your typical strip mall look and feel where I think we have the opportunity with it being a gateway and with it being in the area that it's in to be more pedestrian friendly and to have some of those components that you want in a neighborhood center. And staff had given me a copy of work done by an intern back in 2013. And it's a document that really is a good document that helps to show and illustrate how neighborhood centers are designed to work. And I think it's the vision your comp plan sets forth, but with your zoning not complete, your staff and developers and other people don't have the opportunity to implement the vision in the comp plan with the zoning that is in place. So I would encourage you to look at that. Just one last thing on triggers. when you look at an area for a land use, I think you question if you're saying that all the conditions are ripe for the corner on the northwest corner of that area. I guess it's the southwest corner of Johnstown in Ohio. I think if all the conditions are ripe there to consider that to be less urban residential and more commercial, that there ought to be mechanisms in place that trigger nodes or overlay zones that would have the City Planning Commission initiate land use amendments and/or zoning amendments when those may be appropriate. So just when we talk about thinking outside of the box, I would think that there are different tools that we can give that encourage infill and redevelopment, and we need to equip the planning staff with those tools. Thanks.
Thank you. Other comments? Then we will bring it back up here for action, please.
Just one final question, and Ms. Driscoll, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I guess I am. I know that when we were talking about Crawford and we were talking about overlay districts and things like that, do we have overlay districts on the areas, or on any of the areas that have been identified as gateways in the community? I mean, I'm just, don't get me wrong, this project is great and everything, but just in terms of a broader question of being able to make sure that we take a closer look at gateways and integrate them if we've gone to the expense and the effort of making a complete street. Do we have any overlays on any other gateways?
So I think there's a couple things going on here. Yes,
Good.
we have some
Help
overlays
walk me out of the
on
woods,
gateways,
please.
and I appreciate where Mr. Blanchard's coming from and some of the suggestions and tools he has. I think I would set precedent in that you have a document right now, and it's a living, breathing tool, and it is kind of coming up on its shelf life. You know, they typically last about 10 years. You've got another 2 or 3 years to go through this. So it's normal to have some of these kind of growing pains to kind of wonder, is this kind of working the same way we intended almost 10 years ago? And there are new tools that have kind of come around. Dean and I have been talking about the issue between the zoning recommendations matching up with those land use recommendations, and we will be prioritizing that this year to bring you an updated version of that will incorporate some of our zones into those land use and make them match. I think at that same time, one of the things we could look at is there a new zone that we need to add that would be a better tool to help kind of address some of these things? That's very doable. I'm not sure if a bunch of overlays are really what you're looking for. They can get very messy very quickly, because one of the things that it's important to have really effective zoning and have happy development community is for all those regulations to be very clear and forward. And when we start putting overlays over everything, you really lose that. So if the real intention is there, we need to make sure it's there in the base zoning and not necessarily have to have multiple overlays. And at the same time, you know, it might be a good point to look at the map and say, are there some changes we need to have? You know, as far as creating triggers and things like that for the Planning Commission, or for development itself, those are some pretty complex tools, and they're usually kind of bigger issues that need to be placed throughout the community. That might be something I'd suggest looking at when we do a more comprehensive review, or, you know, a 10-year update of the comprehensive plan, that those kinds of tools be implemented, because they have other things that need to go with them. Does that make sense? You know, just kind of popping down and saying, hey, when we get this many ADTs at this intersection, it automatically becomes that. I mean, the dominoes that go with that are significant, but we can create new zones that would address some of these kind of transect zoning is a lot of times what it calls, where, you know, you go from core urban uses and then you start to merge out to your suburban uses, that in-between hitherland, where you have a lot more mixed use going on. You know, we can start to address that. But I wouldn't say that the zones that we have aren't adequate to do what you need right now.
Okay, and I think I'm following you, and thanks for indulging me in the conversation. So there would be a means, as you and Dean kind of work through this and try to get things aligned. So, because I think that's a little bit where I'm having some of the issues here in terms of reconciling that. There would be a mechanism or some sort of zoning or something where we could designate something straightforward that, like, we want to emphasize, say, like these particular gateways, or these are particular impact streets, and there's a better way to do that than by creating some sort of overlay. That's what.
Yeah, I think
okay,
I think
okay.
you got two things that would probably solve your problem. Is one, is we need to do some housekeeping to reconcile the zones that we
Right.
currently have
Right,
with the
with
land
the
use
land
criteria
use-
in the comp
right.
plan. Yep,
Right.
very doable. And then option number two is, do we have the right type of zone to accommodate this kind of transition between urban and rural as best as possible? And if not, we can look at, do you need to add a new zone, or is it time to maybe update the map and do different, those nodes and things like that? So we can look at that kind of secondary option, but it doesn't have to necessarily be an overlay zone. There are other tools to accomplish that, and I think we understand where you guys are going, so we could definitely handle that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Other discussion? Is there action on this item?
Well, I'd like to make the motion, but I just would like to preface this by saying that I really do look forward to kind of getting a reconciliation or a correlation between our zoning and our comp plan. And unfortunately, I feel like, we've got a hammer right now, so we've got to use the hammer. And I don't want to hold up this project because I think it's a very worthy project, but even though I'm not 100% comfortable with the way we've chosen to go, I would like to make the motion that we approve on first reading, ordinance number 18-10934, to amend the future land use map of the Salina, Kansas Comprehensive Plan to change the future land use designation of the southwest corner of North Ohio Street and Johnstown Avenue from future urban residential to future commercial.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That item passes 5-0. 8.2,
Item 8.2, first reading ordinance number 18-10935, requesting a change in zoning district classification from R1 Single Family Residential to C5 Service Commercial on property addressed as 115, 119, and 123 North Ohio Street.
Mr. Andrews.
This is a companion item to the item you just heard. The primary difference here is that Mr. Richardson owns or had contracts for 3 of the 4 properties that you discussed in the previous item. He does not own 1038 Johnstown, so that is not included in this request for a change in zoning classification. So the surveyor's plat number 12 that we're referring to here was recorded in 1918, and Lot 1 was originally occupied by houses that faced Iron, Ohio, and Johnstown. In 1957, there were 2 houses that faced Iron, and those houses were removed, and they were replaced with a small filling station. In 1973, that filling station was torn down, and a new, larger filling station was constructed in its place at the northwest corner of Iron and Ohio. And in its last version, it was a Pump Mart convenience store. That convenience store closed, the building was removed, and the site has remained a vacant paved lot since that time. The 4 houses on the northern portion were constructed in the 1920s. In 1957, this home right here was replaced with a newer home. So if you go by that area, the dwelling right there in the corner is slightly newer than the other homes in the area. Mr. Richardson has purchased this property, and has a contract to purchase this property. Is in negotiation to purchase that property. The application that's before you is to rezone this property, and this property to C5 Service Commercial, and to join that with the property on the corner that's already zoned C5. And so if this request is approved, it would allow him to move forward with his purchase of 115 North Ohio, which is the skinnier, deeper lot directly to the north there, and move forward with his plans to develop the property. The property he does not control or own at this time is the one at 1038 Johnstown, which is 96 feet wide and 118 feet deep. And so the applicant may very well develop this project in phases, and he has described one of the things we were curious about was whether he was looking at doing an upper story residential component, but at this time that's not part of his plan. And so the request before you is to rezone the property to C5 service commercial, and we identified that would include almost any commercial or retail use, including offices, retail stores, and restaurants. Conditional uses include multifamily residential. C5 does allow for outdoor storage and display of goods and equipment, but the plan for the property does not appear to include any of that. One of the questions that was asked in the C3 district, the maximum building height is 35 feet. In C5, the maximum height is 50 feet, and the lot coverage allowed is 50% in the C5 zone, whether it's 30, or it's actually 40% in the C3 zone. Regardless of what commercial zoning classification you're in, there is a 15-foot landscape buffer requirement, and so there would be a need for a buffer and some form of solid screening where commercial development abutted residential on the west. And as we have discussed, our zoning, our base zoning, does not have aesthetic requirements for buildings. Planned commercial districts have some general aesthetic standards, but they do give the Planning Commission and City Commission the authority to review and approve design, materials, and appearance of buildings. As you are aware, this request area is located at the edge of a defined neighborhood. It's along an arterial street, and given its frontage on a heavily traveled street, proximity to the intersection, the applicant believes that this strip of land is more suitable for high-intensity uses than single-family residential. We have R1 zoning on the west, north, and east, but at Ohio Street, there is C5 zoning at all 4 quadrants of the intersection. If this request is approved, it would be an expansion of an existing commercial node. And so in staff's view, given the preponderance of C5 zoning, the zoning uses of nearby property would be consistent on this property with what's around it. So again, your role in this case is to decide upon and establish where the commercial residential boundary should be on the west side of North Ohio Street. And we do believe that Johnstown Avenue is a logical location to establish a commercial residential boundary. There's existing water in place in Ohio Street and in Iron and in Johnstown, which is available. There's a 10-inch sanitary sewer, which is capable of serving any development on this. There is a storm sewer at the intersection that collects runoff. It actually goes north up to Johnstown, and then there's a large storm sewer at Johnstown that runs to the old river channel and discharges there. Ohio carries over 15,000 vehicles a day. There is a center turn lane there and with full turning movements, but we will want to carefully look at the location of driveways and curb cuts as it relates to the intersection. Iron Avenue is an impact street, and those improvements have been made accordingly, and staff and the Planning Commission believe that the project proposed by the applicant could provide a nice gateway or entryway for that corridor starting at Ohio and leading to the downtown area. So on the question of zoning, the Planning Commission conducted a public hearing on the applicant's request to go from R1 to C5, and there was some discussion about planned commercial zoning, but the Planning Commission ultimately recommended approval of C5 zoning, and their findings are on page 7 of your report and also incorporated in the attached ordinance. The Planning Commission felt strongly enough about this project that they voted to initiate the rezoning of 1038 Jonestown themselves, so the applicant would not be delayed in applying to rezone that remaining portion should he complete the acquisition of that property. And so that would be scheduled to go to the Planning Commission on June 5th. So your options as it relates to the 3 lots would be to concur with the recommendation of the Planning Commission and approve ordinance changing the zoning classification of this property from R1 to C5 on first reading. This would require 3 votes. If you believe that the concurrent review of a site development factor or development plan is a factor that you would like to consider as part of this rezoning request, and that a specific plan is should be a part to ensure that there are compatible land use relationships, you could recommend this application be amended to Plan C5. That would require 4 votes from the commission, and it would require the applicant to amend their application and also to submit a site development plan for concurrent review as part of the rezoning request. Or the second option would be to condition it where a deferred site plan would come back for review and approval prior to issuance of a building permit. And so I think you have the conceptual plan in there, Dustin. We were very careful to label this in your packet as a conceptual plan because it's very roughed out. It was designed and intended to provide the Planning Commission and City Commission with an idea or concept as to why the additional land area was needed and how the site would be developed if the zoning change was approved, but it is a concept plan and it is not binding. And so staff oftentimes refers to planned commercial zoning as what you see is what you get zoning. And what we mean by that is that when you have planned commercial zoning that's accompanied by a plan, and the plan is reviewed and approved as part of the rezoning request, that becomes part of the zoning action, and what the applicant develops is what is on the approved plan. We don't feel at this point it's fair that this is conceptual. It's not fully developed, so I don't think it's ready for inclusion. But if the City Commission felt that planned commercial was a better option, then the choices would be to amend the application and have a plan come back that would go before you before any action was taken on the zoning change. Or the second method is what we refer to as a deferred site plan, where the zoning change is approved, but that no development of the site occur until that deferred site plan comes before either the Planning Commission and City Commission, or at least the Planning Commission. Your third option would be to refer this back to the Planning Commission for reconsideration if you disagree with their approach, or you could overturn the Planning Commission and decide that R1 zoning should remain in place on this property, and that would involve a motion that the attached ordinance not be approved. So hopefully I've laid out your alternatives there, but this was and was treated as an application for straight C5 zoning, that the site plan was conceptual and for informational purposes to help form a picture of how the property would be developed and why the additional land area was needed, but it would have to be refined and additional detail provided if it was going to be considered concurrently. But if that was the case, then the approach there would be to postpone consideration of the rezoning request until you had a site development plan that you could review concurrently with that, or the other option would be to move forward with the zoning change, but require that a site plan be submitted on a deferred basis before development occurred. So with that, I'd be open to any questions you have about the zoning aspect of this.
Just a few questions, and unfortunately, they're not in any logical order, so I apologize for that ahead of time. Just as background, is there anything else on the other three corners of Ohio and Iron that could not have gone into a C3 area? There's a
Taco Bell would, the car wash would be considered. I'd have to double check, but I don't believe that car washers are allowed in C3. I think the only way you can have a car wash in C3 is if it's attached to a convenience store. So in that case, the car wash, I'm not sure about a 5-bay car wash, but at least a car wash that's accessory to a convenience store would be allowed in C3, but not a freestanding. And the truck dealer on the corner would not be allowed if that was zone C3. The Dower truck sales could not be there if that was a C3 zone property.
Okay. My big concern is when commercial moves in adjacent to an established residential area, that buffer between them, and I'm not sure, you mentioned earlier the owner did not have a plan, yet there's a concept plan. So I don't know whether he has a plan or doesn't have a plan. But, what you showed us looks like a plan, but he could go up 50 feet, you said, in C5?
In C5, the maximum building height is 50 feet. In C3, the maximum height is 35 feet.
Okay. Because not only do you have this going next to an established residential area, it's also one corner of it. It's going to be part of our gateway to downtown. I'm not sure what aesthetics other people expected of a gateway street to downtown, but I'd like to know we have some way of protecting the sanctity of a gateway street, which until you get actually downtown is pretty much entirely, well, almost entirely residential till you get down to close to the grocery store. I guess I like the idea of retaining some control over the plan with a planned commercial. I don't think anyone would put a 50-foot building there, but look a little out of place, I think, to the residents behind it. I'm still thinking. Anyone else want to go ahead and talk?
Anybody else
go
want to
ahead.
jump in, and we'll come back to you?
Okay, so just help walk me through this scenario. So if today, right now, we zone this C5, and for some reason, heaven forbid, this project doesn't proceed, we could end up with another car lot or another car wash or something of that nature on that particular corner without asking for a site plan.
That is correct.
Would having the C5 on the condition of having an approved site plan, that would give us a little bit more measure of control in terms of buffer zone or appearance, or is that just?
Very, very much so, so that if, given the two scenarios, let's say you were comfortable with the plan and the uses, then under the option 2 there, you would have the discretion to recommend Plan C5 in lieu of C5, and then you could designate that either if you were comfortable with the C5, then you would have Plan C5, and the ordinance would have to be amended to require that a site development plan be submitted for review and approval prior to issuance of a building permit, similar to what was done with Popeyes. But that is why we clearly identified that as a conceptual plan, because as long as you are in the realm of straight commercial zoning, you are giving whoever owns the property the discretion to do something that C5 allows that may not be part of the original intent for the rezoning, but the only way to truly control that is either to eliminate uses or to have retained control over the final site development plan.
Dean, does the old Pump Mart location, that's with the conceptual drawing, that's going to be part of this plan, right?
Right.
Okay.
So-
Has the old pumps, has the old tanks been removed from the old, it has
Yes,
been over there?
they have been.
I actually have a question for Mr. Richardson, if it's appropriate at this
Did you
time.
have some more questions for Mr. Andrews?
No, I guess it's more a comment. Now, of course, I probably moved here after that pump station was torn down, so I have no working memory ever of there being anything on that lot, which obviously it was commercial before then, but it
Another
was
gas station.
just another gas station. Okay. So there was commercial there before, obviously. I'm more worried about a real tall commercial building, or if plans fell through, something like a storage facility could go in C5.
It is a permitted,
Permitted
it
use.
is a conditional use, but you can have mini storage or a commercial storage building in a C5 district, yes.
I'm just, if Iron is truly going to be one of our gateway streets, who knows, maybe one day with arch or monuments going down it or something, I just want to make sure that its entrance off of Iron off of Ohio is appropriate. But we could hear from.
How did the
Mr.
discussion
Richardson.
with the Planning Commission go concerning C5 versus planned C5?
Well, there was discussion of the planned C5 option, but I think that the planning commissioners were suitably impressed by Mr. Richardson's conceptual plans for the property, but it's entirely possible that they didn't think through all of those steps. But we have had cases like that before. There was that we try to remind commissioners that you do have an applicant that's before you, but you really are looking at what is the most appropriate use of the property irrespective of the applicant. And so you have to think through all of these alternatives. The one thing we did discuss with the Planning Commission, and it relates back to Commissioner Hodges' comment, if this was a neighborhood center instead of a commercial land use area, then it could only be done as a planned commercial change. And so the commercial area, it is not required that it be done through a planned commercial, but you still have the discretion if you believe that a site development plan is a relevant factor in the consideration of the zoning change, then you have the discretion to require that. The Taco Bell that was there was built originally in the 90s. It was completely torn down and replaced by a new Taco Bell in the same place. We actually got a little better landscaping the second time around, but it was C5, so it allowed the original Taco Bell and it allowed the replacement without any review. The only thing that was done as a plan is when the Green Lantern expanded their commercial area over to Connecticut, the city commission required that to be done as a planned C5 because they wanted to see the plan for the expanded car wash and review that as part of the zoning change. So that was residentially zoned property that they expanded, and so it was done as a Plan C5 so that a plan could be reviewed and approved as part of the zoning change.
Give us the additional steps required to go to a PC5 versus the straight C5.
If you had 4 votes that were in favor of that today, then your action was, let's say that you said that you were comfortable with C5, that you wanted it to be Plan C5, and that you wanted to have a requirement that a site development plan come back to you before a building permit was issued. Then you would choose option 2. You would make a motion that this be approved for Plan C5 instead of C5, and that a site development plan be submitted for review prior to issuance of a building permit. That would require us to take this existing ordinance that is attached, and we would modify it so that it was said Plan C5 instead of C5, and then we would outline that as a condition. It was the same thing that was done with the, except it was done in reverse with the Popeyes. In that case, the Planning Commission recommended at the beginning that it be done as a Plan C5. It ended up as a planned C3. But if your desire was that this be Plan C5 and not C5, you could do it at today's meeting unless you wanted to see a fully developed site development plan before you voted on the zoning change, in which case you would have to postpone action. Mr. Richardson would have to submit a site development plan to come before you that we would write a report on so that you could review that as part of your decision about whether the property should be rezoned. But if you're comfortable with the rezoning aspect and just would like to see it be planned and would like to retain the opportunity to review the site development plan before anything was built, then that could be done at today's meeting.
And that PC5 would have to also go through Planning Commission. It would. It could just come direct.
Not if there were 4 of you who thought Plan C5 was the preferred approach.
I'd like to hear from the applicant on that if we could.
Commissioners, while you wait for that, one thing that's probably minor but may not be later when you think about findings of fact in a motion is that you've talked quite a bit about the gateway aspect of that. I don't know if that's specific or generically, but when you look at your comp plan, it does make reference to stated gateways, both existing and future. And it currently does not show that area as a gateway. It's a complete street. It's an impact street. It does show a future gateway much closer to the core downtown, but it doesn't show that intersection as a gateway. So when you're thinking about your motion, you want to be careful with that. If you use finding of fact as a gateway because the comp plan doesn't support that, and it doesn't mean you couldn't change that at some point if you wish to, you certainly could, but right now it doesn't show that. So an equivalent statement, if you ever get there, would be due to the quality of the complete street and investment made there, something like that. I think it gets to what you're talking about. It's just being careful with the semantics when you get to a motion findings of fact.
That's a good point. I think we referred to it as a gateway to downtown, but it's a good distinction to keep in mind. Thank you.
If you'd like to address the applicant or have him address you, I'll vacate the stands.
Brian Richardson, 361 North Holmes, and I'd be glad to address multiple questions that seem to be.
I think my only question for you is, what's your reaction to a potential planned commercial C5, a planned C5 as opposed to a straight C5? Understanding, I mean, my caveat is that if this is built, wonderful, awesome. I'm just worried about in the event that it's not built and we've already changed the zoning, that it could, you know, morph into something that we haven't anticipated. Would you be amenable to a PC5?
Well, my first thought is it's more time and more money, because it's more steps in 90 days or whatever that calendar looks like, and that is purposeful. My question may be for Mr. Andrews, because I'm not completely sure. The corner would remain C5, correct? As we're discussing today, because the 4 lots are what's before us?
It would, but the plan, if it incorporated into the planned area, would have to be for the whole area. They couldn't, you could not ignore half of the building.
Sorry.
That would be the other option, would be to try to convert the entire parcel to Plan C5, but even if only the north portion was Plan C5, you wouldn't be able to have unless you had a completely independent plan for the south part, it wouldn't be possible to review a site development plan for the site while ignoring what was on the south part of it.
But there could be 2 different possible, I mean, you could put a subway on the C5 and something else on C3.
On the Plan C5, yes.
Plans, okay. Other questions?
No, I think Commissioner Hodge just summarized my feeling exactly. I wouldn't have anything to add to it.
You'll go ahead with at least phase 1, even if you do not get the Johnstown property purchased, is that correct?
I am looking at doing that, yes.
Where does that put the contingent rezoning request on that other piece of property if we go towards the PC route?
Well, if you were to recommend Plan C5 for the lots on Ohio, then again, the Planning Commission they felt that the highest and best use of the whole piece was commercial, so they initiated the rezoning of Mr. Otting's property on the hope that Mr. Richardson could complete his purchase before all that went forward. But if you decide on planned C5 for this part, then that part would also end up being planned C5.
Just to follow up to the question just before then, you mentioned phase 1 of the project that could go on the southernmost portion of the property. Is that phase 1, does that split that concept drawing? I mean, is that concept drawing all one structure, or is that actually something you could split?
It's designed right now to be split if need be.
But when it was all done, it would look like one
Yes, sir.
building? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Without giving out names or anything, do you currently have tenants, I'll say on the hook, for lack of a better word?
I have potential, 3 of the 4 bays that I have interest in, but I have no leases.
Yes.
I kind of want to reiterate that in addition to the PC option, you still can also look at other commercial zones. So if we're having the discussion with the applicant about C5, there was some earlier discussion about C3, because that also, if we're talking about time and money, that could be addressed differently on, what that could do to the development. So I'm just kind of bringing that back.
Well, good. Not to put you on a quick spot, but you have any comments on that?
I don't have any plans today of doing anything exterior-wise, as the concept plan shows. Obviously, as a developer, one of the things you don't want to do is get backed into a corner that you don't have the flexibility. The biggest thing that I see that may be a hindrance, and maybe there's a way to work the two together with a C3, is depending on a restaurant concept. One of the things we want to do on the North Bay was to potentially get a restaurant on the lower level with some rooftop seating and something that would be a little different to the community. That may require more parking, and so the coverage needed that Dean was alluding to with between the 50 and 40%. I don't know whether there's a way to go to a C3, still allow additional coverage if we needed additional parking. If there was some opportunity for that, I certainly would have some consideration, because today I certainly don't have a need for storage units or car dealership or some of those opportunities.
I think that really speaks to what you were talking about, Ms. Driscoll, in terms of needing to do some work on these transitional areas between urban and residential. I mean, that speaks to it beautifully that, it may be time for us to take a look at, are our parking requirements, reasonable in an area that's more urban in nature. So at this point, it's, would you rather see planned commercial or PC5 or?
My preference would C5.
If you-
That matches the corners.
I understand that. But I didn't know if,
You mentioned timing. Would it be helpful for staff to walk through the timing of the consideration of a plan if it was zoned to PC5?
I talked to Mr. Andrews a little bit, but I think I'm good. Thanks, Mr. Strike.
it'd be helpful for me, if you don't mind doing a real quick refresher course on if we were to choose the option of submitting a deferred site development plan.
I was actually volunteering Mr. Andrew for that.
Well, based on the discussion, you have more options than even are laid out in your report. The a planning commission can recommend, and a city commission can approve any lesser change than what the applicant requests at the same meeting. So this has been applied for as a C5. If you, as a commission, said C5's a bridge too far, you could live with C3, you could do that today with 4 votes. If you thought that it should be Plan C3, you could do that today with 4 votes. If you thought it should be Plan C5, you could do that today with 4 votes. And it could come back next week for second reading, and the property would be rezoned to whatever classification that was in. That would tell Mr. Richardson that he has his zoning. If you approved it with a deferred site plan, then at such time as he had his plan developed, then he would file an application with the planning division, and he would have roughly a 30-day time frame where it would go before the planning commission. And if you reserved the final authority from the time that he filed his application to when it went before the city commission, would probably be in the neighborhood of 45 to 50 days. So it's a 2-step process where we've sent notice out to neighbors, we posted a sign, everyone knows that it's proposed for commercial development. If the commercial zoning is in place and the site plan is deferred, then when Mr. Richardson submits his site plan, then we would take that, we would provide a copy of the site plan and notice to neighboring property owners within 200 feet. The planning commission would review that site plan at a public hearing where neighbors could have input. They would make a recommendation. That would come to you. And so the difference is that when you're dealing with straight commercial zoning, you have a first reading, you have a second reading, and the zoning is in place. If you have that and it's a planned district with deferred site plan approval, then you are looking at that time frame plus whenever Mr. Richardson's ready to pull the trigger and has his site plan that he wants to develop, then he would submit an application. It would go to the Planning Commission with a public hearing and then come to you for review and approval. And then once that occurred, then that would be, he would be eligible to get a building permit. But the primary difference is if you have straight C5, then you're submitting a building permit at your time frame. It's reviewed administratively by staff. No commission sees it, and it gets built. If it's done as a planned district, then the site plan goes before the Planning Commission first with a public hearing, then comes back before you for final decision. That is what happened in the case of Popeyes. And so when Popeyes had their final plan prepared, that came forward, went to the Planning Commission, and then came before you for a final review of that site development plan. So from the developer or applicant's point of view, it's about a 45 to 50-day public review process versus a 10-day administrative building permit review. That is the primary difference. It creates a second step, and the only alternative to that is if the applicant is so, if you have an example like Menards was done in one step where they had a rezoning application and they had a highly detailed plan for everything, and their rezoning request and their plan was reviewed concurrently. And so when their zoning was approved, their site plan was approved. But I don't think Mr. Richardson is in that place. So it would seem like the deferred option would be the better option in this case. And so what that would mean is that whatever you decide, C3, Plan C3, Plan C5, or C5, those options are all available to you. And if the option was to have a deferred site plan, then we'd have first reading of whatever you approved today. You'd have second reading of whatever you approve next week. The zoning would be in place with no building permit to be issued until you had reviewed and approved the plan for the property.
Thank you.
You know, we've had that corner sitting there as C5 for a long time, and nothing's really happened. So what we're really doing is looking at, a little bit of a turning some of that to the north end into C5. We also have a local developer that I think has a proven record, so I think we need to take that into consideration too.
Oh, I agree. I mean, and that's the whole thing. Mr. Richardson's a proven developer. His plan looks great. I'm not worried about if this plan is executed as presented. I did have a follow-up question for Mr. Gage. So the fact that this intersection it's not even designated as a future gateway. The only gateways are to downtown. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It doesn't show that as an
As a
existing or
gateway.
future, but there
Okay.
is a gateway on Iron Street that
Okay.
really is right on the edge of
But
downtown.
okay, I
Yep.
gotcha.
Was there any other questions?
And again, it's you're putting commercial into residential, and Ohio, it is a busy street, and you just see the residential areas somewhat being eroded. I don't know how much you can keep jabbing it in before Ohio ceases to exist as a residential option. I mean, the concept plan.
Might not
I
be a
think-
bad idea.
Well, and that's another decision, right? I mean, and I
as
agree with
busy
you.
as
I
it
mean,
is at times,
but
so, yeah.
Easy for us to say we're not living in a house in Ohio. We'd probably feel different if it had been our family house for 30 years. But I would think that if we were putting commercial in at the corner of Markley and Magnolia, there'd probably be a site plan review before it was approved, or there'd be some review. I don't think this residential area should be treated any less importantly as others in town. I mean, it worked well for the Popeyes just south of Crawford. So I'd be in favor of the PC. I could live with the 5, just I'd like to know what's going there, so in case this plan doesn't come to fruition, you know, we're not totally out of control over what goes on that site.
I'll say that as a motion.
Well, we didn't allow the public to comment
sorry.
about this, so beyond the developer and the staff reports, is there anybody that had any comments about this? Okay, sorry, now we can get back to our, oh, we have Judy, see? So,
Bad penny returns. Mr. Richardson has done a phenomenal job of putting things together. My concern is the used car lot. And I just want to make sure the alley, what direction is Steve's alley from?
To the north.
Yeah. Okay. There's an alley on the north, and I just want to make sure that that alley is not ignored or trashed or whatever, you know, in this whole thing. I have personal reasons for it, but at the same time, to Dr. Davis's thoughts, we can't, you know, convert everything to commercial. We have to think of the people that live and work there. So, thank you.
thank you.
Mr. Andrews, is that alley vacated? Part of that alley vacated there by where
This alley here terminates right there. It's, I mean, it's dating back to the maybe 100 years or whatever when this was. So the alley just comes from Kansas Avenue, goes here and terminates, and this, it doesn't physically go through. I think the alley she may be referring to is over here. There's a City Go bus stop.
Because
right
people have
here,
entered that
and
alley
there's
through the vacant lot, but that's not really.
No,
That's
people,
not meant to be.
because there's no barrier there, people have used this as a cut through before, but there's no actual city alley right away there.
Thank you. Back to the commission for discussion. Personally, I favor approving it as presented by the planning commission. They were unanimous.
Same here.
Is there a motion on this item?
I don't know how to phrase it, but I'd like to end up with it ending up as a Plan C5. And I honestly don't know how to phrase it. Is that a sufficient?
Probably just a motion to rezone the property to a planned C5 district.
Move to rezone this property, and I'm sure it's outlined in here, to Plan C5.
Second?
Been moved and seconded. Is there further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
So we have 3 opposed. Would someone like to restate the motion in an alternative?
Mayor Ryan, I move that the commission concur with the recommendation of the planning commission and approve ordinance number 18-10935, changing the zoning classification from property from R1, single-family residential, to C5, service commercial, on first reading.
Second.
Been moved and seconded. Is there further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Nay.
The motion passes 3-2 for the first reading of the ordinance. Okay. Yes, we're going to take a short break, 10 minutes. Is that? Okay, we'll come back in at 6:25. Yeah. Good to be back in session, and I think everyone directly involved is back. We'll bring the meeting back to order, please. I think we're ready for 8.3.
Item 8.3, first reading ordinance number 18-10936, establishing a moratorium on electronic changeable copy advertising signs, digital billboards within the city limits. 8.3A, declare a public interest exists for second reading on the same day. And 8.3B, second reading ordinance number 18-10936.
Mr. Gage.
Commissioners, one thing I want to, before we get started, I want to make sure that you have in front of you is you should have a copy of an email that was sent from Daniel Friesen with Ideatech. You have that? Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure that you had that. I'm going to go ahead and defer the actual report conversation back over to Mr. Andrew, who can probably give you a little better overview than me, since the Planning Division has been actually addressing it more specifically. But let me give you the quick overview, and I'll let him fill in the details. What we have is, as you can see here, is we have a request for permitting of some digital advertising signs, or digital billboards, if you want that, so you can put it in that perspective. There are 4 locations. In reviewing those in light of our zoning code and our sign code, there are some certain concerns that are generally talked about in the report, in the blue sheet. And sometimes what happens is when you have a request, and especially if it's impactful, you have to look at your code and say, is that how we want our code to be, and does it address the needs? And ultimately, that's a question that goes back to the governing body as a choice of what they want to do with the code and how. But unfortunately, sometimes a request will prompt that. Many times, as you know, the codes are pretty thick, and we're not always entirely on top of every aspect of the code that may actually need to be amended at some point in the future. So we're reminded at times with an application. That's an inconvenience. To be straightforward, that's an inconvenience and unfortunate for an applicant at that, and it's that when that happens, because they're ready to move forward. And in this case, they're pretty close to being ready. I think there are a couple aspects that deal with the application, but very, very close. But staff really thought, after talking about this in significant detail, that you may want the opportunity to take what we call a timeout or a moratorium on the permitting of digital billboards in the community, so that staff could work with both the Planning Commission and you to determine if certain amendments to the zoning code are necessary and need to be made in advance of this, and any request that could occur during the time of the moratorium. So with regards to that, there's a significant history here, and it deals with existing regulations where you find those for the various districts, so that you have that. But what staff is actually recommending here would be a timeout and a moratorium. Now, with that said, the memo that you have in front of you is from Mr. Friesen, and Ideatech is the applicant in this particular case that would be immediately affected. We don't know if there would be any other applications that could be affected. And what he's talking about here, you can read into this, and you can tell that the preference would be not to have a moratorium. At this point, the recommendation is for 120 days. It could be shortened even if you start at that, if the task is completed earlier. But in this case, they'd like to avoid that, and you'll see from the request an opportunity to rescind the current permit requests or permit applications for the current projects, in order to provide time to see if there's a means to work out any possible differences between the code and the permit applications that we currently have. I'll have to defer that to the planning staff. I don't know if that probability of matching those up is a high probability or not. I suspect it might not be, because there are a lot of aspects that you look at when you deal with electronic billboards, from size, placement, and other aspects of that. So there are quite a few pieces to that. So I don't know if that would be successful or not, but I told Mr. Friesen that it certainly is reasonable to make the request, and we would make sure that you have that, and that would be a judgment that you would get to make as well as a governing body. That's why we wanted to do that. With that, I will turn it over to either Lauren or Dean. I don't know which of you would want to fill in the actual details as it relates to looking at the concerns you may have with the zoning code language. But looks like Dean's ready to hop up, so turn it over to him to talk more about that and give you a chance to contemplate it.
Well, the the idea behind a moratorium is to stop any pending applications or anything that is before staff in its tracks, and to give the governing body and planning commission the opportunity to decide what works for the Salina community. And as we noted, this technology really emerged as much as a little more than 10 years ago when we brought it to the Planning Commission's attention. We actually had a planning commissioner at the time who owned a sign company he didn't install signs in Salina, but he owned a company in Belleville, and he was helpful to the Planning Commission in educating them on the technology. And for better or worse, we had study sessions and laid things out, but neither really the Planning Commission or City Commission wanted to move forward with initiating a text amendment to essentially set up ground rules for digital billboards, because some commissioners felt that would only encourage them to occur. And so we've basically had this be dormant for all that period of years. I'm sure if you've driven around, you've been to other communities where you have seen digital billboards, and you have seen Wichita has digital billboards. One of the interesting lessons from the city of Wichita is they allowed digital billboards. Then there was a very large public outcry about those that had been installed. Then they put a moratorium on any new digital billboards while they, and then worst of all, they left it to staff to try to go back and retrofit the billboards that had already been put up to comply with the standards that the governing body came up with. So we think the better approach is to have a timeout before anything actually gets installed. And our concern was that if we move forward and issued permits for these 4 applications, that some commissioners and some members of the community might have been shocked that those were allowed. So some of the things we discussed with the Planning Commission was that absent any changes to our current codes, we believe there's a possibility of not only putting up new types of signs, but also taking some of our existing billboards and simply converting them to an electronic format. And so one of the things that we hoped for, and in the letter from Mr. Friesen kind of alludes to that, but in many of the sign companies that staff has talked to, their approach that they were going to take was that they would sit down and work with staff on developing a text amendment, and then once that was adopted, then they would start submitting applications. In this case, we got 4 applications first that we felt we had to respond to. So what the Planning Commission and City Commission have done to date is they've started small. They've developed specific regulations for electronic changeable copy signs in residential zoned areas at churches and schools. So there's a church at Roach and Cloud that has a small electronic message center sign. Belmont Christian Church has a small electronic message center sign. And then we also addressed public use districts, and we also addressed university districts, but we haven't addressed the community at large. And so the idea is that you're taking something and to just give you an idea, we get a number of comments about the Bank 6 sign on South Ohio, which is perceived as being relatively large, and it is 68 square feet, and the digital area of that is 36 square feet. And in the case of a billboard, you'd be talking about 200 to 300 to 400 square feet of digital sign area. So roughly 10 times the size of what you see on Bank 6. So we thought that, given that we had these pending applications that we didn't feel comfortable moving forward with without at least raising this question with the city commission, that it seemed that this was the time, if there ever was one, to develop for the community reasonable time, place, and manner rules for those types of billboards. We've already worked to accommodate the digital electronic copy signs at the smaller scale, but this is the first time that we've had discussions, but nobody's actually submitted applications. So the idea would be that during the 120 days, we would work with the sign industry, with the planning commission, with the city commission to educate, to do research, to come up with options, and some of the things that we don't have that maybe we wish we had might be separation requirements from residential areas or separation requirements between signs. Two of these that are being requested are right across the street from each other at 9th and Crawford, and the two signs would probably be separated by maybe 100 feet. And sadly, in the case of Crawford, that street is also regulated by the Kansas Highway Beautification Act, and we are in a position where we'd have to rely on the state to regulate that because our regulations are silent. So Dustin, I think you have 3 maps there that show agricultural. So we gave you a summary in your packet, but just to give you an idea, this is all the property that's inside the city limits that is zoned A1 agricultural. And as you can see from your report, billboards are allowed in A1 district, and that's on the assumption that you have, a lot of times you have A1 on the edge of town or next to the interstate, but we also have some A1 that maybe it wouldn't be that desirable to have electronic billboards on. And then if you could show the C5, C6, and C7. So this is property in the city limits at zone C5, C6, or C7. Again, all of those shaded areas are locations where you could legally place a billboard if you could meet all the other requirements for sign area and height. And just for your benefit, we allow 4 square feet of sign area for each lineal foot of building frontage, and many of our properties in Salina don't come close to using all of their sign area that's allocated to their property. And if the business that's there doesn't utilize it, then someone else can come in and utilize it until the property is maxed out. And then the final one is the industrial I2 and I3. So again, all of those shaded areas that you see there are areas where billboards could be allowed. And so we allow advertising signs, we allow electronic changeable copy signs. We've had some specific regulations for electronic changeable copy signs for residential and public use settings. The sign at Midway for Tony's Pizza Event Center is in a public use district, and so a billboard wasn't allowed there by right, or an advertising sign, but it was done through a planned development district. But we wouldn't have that same opportunity on sites that are already zoned to allow advertising signs. So just some of the things that we have looked at. Without changes, we won't be able to address things like setbacks, maximum sign areas, distance from residential, having some sort of screening or directional cutoff for any lighting or light spill, even hours of operation. So we've given you examples there. In 2014, we had a moratorium on new hookah bars and vapor lounges. While that topic was steadied in 2000, we had a moratorium on new drinking establishments in the downtown, while options for regulating their location were discussed. So a moratorium's not something that you do lightly, but absent a moratorium, then the Planning Commission has agreed to initiate a text amendment to at least start work in this area. But if it's not accompanied by a moratorium, then staff is going to be living in a divided world where part of us are going to be working with Mr. Friesen to try to get his permits processed, and the other part of us will be working prospectively. And we don't really view this as specific to the 4 applications in front of us, but just to the whole general, what does the community want to see in the as to the location, size, separation, those types of things as it relates to this technology. And it's staff's research. We've seen it both ways, and probably half the communities we've seen, the moratorium was done before the very first sign was put up, and in the other cases, the moratorium was put on after negative reaction to signs that had already been installed. So we don't have any electronic changeable copy advertising signs in the city limits, and so this is an opportunity to have the community establish the ground rules that it would like to have, which would be done during that moratorium period. So I'd be happy to address any questions you have about the technology, but it's not that past commissions were unaware of it. It's just that both the Planning Commission and City Commission said, well, maybe we'd just like to wait until somebody actually proposes doing that. And now we have someone who's proposing to do it.
So we waited till we had 4 applications before we decided to put a moratorium on this.
We waited till we had actually received applications that we could review and determine what we could and couldn't regulate about them, and decided that we were at least going to call timeout and ask the question, rather than the analogy I gave was that we used to regularly and consistently get complaints, and city commissioners would get complaints from residential neighbors about oversized garages that went up next to their homes. So we put a cap on the size of the garage you could build, and then if you wanted to go over that, you had to apply for a variance. Your neighbors were notified, they had an opportunity to comment or object, and then that way the comments and complaints could be at the time before something was built, because after it's built, complaining usually doesn't do any good.
Does that Kansas Highway Beautification and Advertising Control Act, can we go lower than they, or were you saying when you refer to that
we can, any locality can be stricter than them. It just so happens they have designated Broadway, they have designated Crawford, they have designated Ohio as, in their view, part of the primary highway system, and they don't regulate on-premise signs, but any type of billboard or advertising sign is subject to theirs. So if you're driving on I-70 and you see billboards along I-70, those billboards have to be reviewed and approved by KDOT under the Highway Beautification Act. Any community can have stricter regulations than what KDOT has, but many of the rural counties don't have any regulations, so they rely on KDOT.
Commissioners, real quick, too, as you contemplate this, kind of a legal framework that's summarized in the report, and Greg can go deeper, if he feels that that's necessary. But and of course, we're talking about, first of all, a temporary moratorium. I think we want to be clear on that, and that's why you establish a time frame. And that is a tool and an authority that governing bodies do have when you're going to consider pending legislation. In other words, you wouldn't do it just for the sake of delaying someone. There needs to be a reason. And in this case, and in any case in our history that we've looked at it, it's about pending legislation when it's determined that to allow an action to proceed under the current laws could lead to what you believe are unacceptable negative consequences that are contrary to the public interest. So ultimately, for you to choose to do that, you would need to believe for yourself that allowing it to go forward would actually create unacceptable negative consequences that are contrary to the public interest. If you don't feel that, then you wouldn't want to support it.
I think we have reason to call a moratorium. I just don't like them very much. So if the applicant, and if I haven't read this email in detail, if he's willing to withdraw his applications, could we just let the process go forward? And
Mayor, if I may, I would like to comment on that aspect of the situation.
Go ahead.
Well, if I may, there's a group of legal points that relates to, if I may quickly, and to follow up quickly on Mr. Gage's comments. Certainly, the use of a moratorium is recognized both at the federal level and in the state of Kansas as a means for legislative bodies such as yourselves to address these types of situations. Again, as Mr. Gage indicated, whether you wish to do that, whether you believe that to be necessary is absolutely a policy question. It's entirely within your purview. If the thought is that you wish to examine your present policy as expressed in the sign regulations, then I do think it's important that the timeout be called and that you examine that policy. This is not about IdeaTech's applications at that point. Once you decide we need to look at the policy, there is nothing, as you would predict, nothing to keep anyone from coming in next week with an application, and we'd be right back in the same conversation. Part of that, too, is I'm sure very well intended, but the preface to that offer to withdraw the applications in the email suggests that a mutually agreeable solution, or that it might be closer to a reasonable path to a mutually agreeable solution than it may seem. While well intended, I'm sure, that is not your objective. Your objective, hopefully with helpful input from anyone who knows anything about this business, including IdeaTech, is to address what you believe to be the correct policy for Salina, Kansas. It is not a negotiation. It is a legislative process where you're dealing with that. So I don't think you want to get into that situation where simply withdrawing an application by a particular applicant is the context in which you attempt to have this conversation. The other aspect about this, and it relates to another point that is made in the memo that I want to be sure you are aware of. As this developed, I can assure you from working with and assisting staff that no one was so presumptuous as to think from the staff standpoint that just because this was presented to you that it would be enacted. The communication that Mr. Friesen refers to, that he, I believe, characterizes as without warning, he knew the moment you knew that this was being brought to your attention. On Friday, just as your supplemental packet was completed and delivered, staff transmitted the very same information to Mr. Friesen. That's obviously what prompted his response, and that was the intent, so he would know, and so that he could respond and provide whatever input he might wish, and that's all fine and well. But at the same time, the same communication, and in fact expressly indicated that it had two purposes. One, to notify him of your consideration of this matter today, and also to further advise him and anyone associated with his company of what needed yet to be done to develop their application. So it wasn't like, oh, well, we're going to ask the commission, I'm referring to staff now, it wasn't, we're going to ask the commission for a moratorium and, surely they'll enact it, so we don't have to do anything more. Everything was done to lay out as well as possible what further work needed to be done on those particular applications. What I thought was most significant is that it was the second request. We still do not have what fits our code definition of applicant, because the city has yet to receive any evidence that Ideatech has the consent of these landowners for what they are proposing. So whether they've talked to them, what they've talked about at this stage isn't so important. What is important is that for there to be a valid application, there has to be evidence of the consent of the underlying owner of that property. And I can look to staff again to be sure, but I don't believe we have any evidence of that at this point in time. Am I correct? So I don't mean to go too technical, but we don't have a valid application as we speak. We do not have any written evidence of consent authorization of the landowners in terms of what is being proposed. So all of those things considered, I would strongly recommend that you either decide that you think, no, we're good, and forge on with our current ordinance as it now exists. If you instead believe that there is some work warranted, you have a legitimate means of doing so and the opportunity to call timeout. So I would think we're either or, and not want to be in that middle position where you're trying to negotiate with a particular party who wishes to advance their own project and potentially have others wish to join in that conversation.
Thank you. Comments to Mr. Bankston's remarks? Anything more from the staff? Would the public like to address this issue? Sure. If you come to the podium, if you would.
Glenn Hills, Ideatech Media, 111 Old Mill Road, Buhler, Kansas. Thank you. That was great. Everything that I've heard here has been positive, and I just wanted to reinsure with Mr. Friesen that everything is going to be positive with this, and that we don't want to have no negativity. The property owners, we have all the signed leases. We did not understand on the code that we were supposed to send the signed leases in with each property owner for the permit applications. And we do have all the leases. I rounded all them up today. I've got all them for them, and he can email them to whoever he needs to email them to. But I do want to let you know that we do have all that documentation. And so just wanted to reiterate that so you have that for your understanding.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions? The applicant. Well, we'll bring it back up here for discussion. Is there more discussion, or would someone would like to propose taking action?
I understand about the need to call for a timeout. I'm just very disappointed in us that, we've known about this since 2007, and I feel like we're being real reactionary, which is not a place I'm comfortable being. But 120 days is going to put us in September. Is there any, to me, that seems a little excessive, but I don't know what's involved with getting, with updating the ordinance. And so I'd like to ask staff if, what would be reasonable from your point of view?
120 days is a good general number, and we felt it left room for, kind of having some flexibility in that and feeling not like we might have to come back for an additional extension. I'm confident that we we will get it done much before that. But I kind of view moratoriums as a transparency thing as well. When you have an issue like this, is it kind of puts everything front and center and says, look, this is a priority. We've got people assigned to this, and there's a certain time clock that's put on this. So as far as a tool, it's really the one that kind of keeps all this kind of the most above board, and to ensure that this gets dealt with in a meaningful way that's really the best for all parties involved. But if the body felt that 120 days was too long, I know our amazing staff could accommodate your needs.
Well, and I hate to ask you to spin straw into gold. I've used that analogy many times, but a question for Mr. Bankston. If we did go with, say, a 90 or 120-day moratorium, and staff was able to turn something around prior to that, are we obligated to staying with the entire 120-day moratorium? Or let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Ms. Driscoll comes back in 2 weeks and she's got this locked down. Would we still be obligated to the 120-day moratorium?
No, I think you can modify that either longer or shorter. Meaning that depends on whether you want to be optimistic and potentially have to extend, and or vice versa. The only thing I would be sure is that we do want, I think, to define the extent. The leading case in Kansas is ours. In Frick versus City of Salina. There, the moratorium was upheld as not having been a taking. As I was called upon to speak to others about that afterward, that one we did not define a specific duration. It was a little difficult at that time, but one thing I think we learned is that we want to be working from a specific date and either come in ahead and modify, or hopefully not have to extend, but everybody knows that we have to readdress and it not just float.
Right, but coming in ahead is an option.
Certainly.
Okay.
Yeah, Commissioners, when we look at the pieces that take the time, the first piece is to put together, it's for staff to put together the information, finish whatever research, put together the options and the report. And then it goes, you're talking about a text amendment, so you're talking about the role of the Planning Commission and you as a City Commission, and as you would any type of text amendment. So once we get the information together, the question becomes, how long does it take to go to the Planning Commission, to the City Commission? Do we end up going back to the Planning Commission and back to you, or do we not? And I think that's going to be a big factor as to how long it takes. But we would certainly wanted to get our initial part done as quickly as possible so we could get it on the agendas, get it scheduled, and then see what happens with regards to that. And as Greg mentioned, we talked about 90 days, but we historically, when we looked at it more a temporary moratorium, it's a little harder to be at a date and ask to add another 30 days than it is to set it and then try to get it earlier and cut it off. You can do either one, but and quite honestly, we could work under either framework. It's really up to you. But sort of, again, if we say 90, it sets that expectation. If we can't meet that for whatever the reason would be, then we're going to have to come back and ask you to extend for a few more days, and it's difficult to do.
The public would have input at the Planning Commission stage and City Commission
Yeah,
final
absolutely.
review? So at least 2 different opportunities.
At least 2, hopefully just 2, if we can put it together right.
And anything you bring us, we may carve it up.
You might.
I'd say we're pretty good at that, actually.
That's. I mean, and then that's your prerogatory. When you set policy, you make policy, and you approve ordinances and amend them. That's your prerogatory. So we recognize that's a possibility. It's not a bad thing, but it could affect the timeline.
I did just want to clarify one item, that under Kansas law, when you're dealing with a zoning ordinance, there's only 3 parties who can initiate a text amendment. One is the Planning Commission. They said they didn't want to initiate one. One's the City Commission. They told us they didn't want to initiate one. And the other is a property owner or someone who's in the sign business. And we've discussed that with people, but no one has come forward and initiated that. Staff cannot simply initiate a text change without bringing it to either the planning commission or city commission to initiate. And so when this was brought to the attention of the planning commission, they changed their mind and they said, yes, now we want to initiate. So.
And just one question on the wording in the agenda. It says first reading is extending a moratorium. Should that be establishing? Oh, there's a new one? Okay, I saw two. I picked, okay, I chose the wrong one as the new one. So that word was establishing? Establishing. Okay, thank you. In that case, Mayor Ryan, I move approval of ordinance number 18-10936, establishing a moratorium on electronic changeable copy advertising signs and digital billboards within the city limits, and declare that a public interest exists for having first and second reading on the same day, and approve the ordinance on second reading as well. That's actually two separate.
Those are two separate considerations.
My mouth was going before faster than my eyes, so I was rolling.
Will
Okay.
will that motion include the 120 days as recommended, as requested by staff?
That's what's in the ordinance.
The ordinance?
Yeah, the ordinance, it's manifested in the...
In the ordinance itself?
The ordinance itself has 120
Okay,
days.
so we can
The
take off
term
the
is
part.
referred to in section 6. And
So my motion would end with the word city limits and not reference the second reading.
I'll second.
Been moved and seconded. Is there further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Passes on first reading 5-0. Public interest.
Yeah, Mayor Ryan, move that we declare a public interest existing for a second reading on the same day in light of the need to move forward with reviewing this matter so that future applications can be addressed in a timely manner.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor of declaring that a public interest exists for second reading, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That passes 5-0.
Mayor Ryan, I move approval on second reading ordinance number 18-10936.
Is there a second? Second. Roll call, please.
Commissioner Davis?
Aye.
Commissioner Hay?
Aye.
Commissioner Hodges?
Aye.
Commissioner Hoppick?
Aye.
Mayor Ryan?
Aye. That will bring us to other business.
Commissioners, real quick, if I may, I just want to say that we do appreciate the applicant's interest in working with us on this and verbalizing that. And so as we go along, we certainly take that seriously, since they do have a pending application. And I'm certain that they will wish to provide their thoughts as to what the context or the text of the final ordinance might be. So we will keep them up to speed with that, as well as the dates and so forth. And for that matter, anyone else that has a stakeholder interest in this. So just so you know that.
Is there any other business?
I guess I would just raise the question again, in light of the fact that Representative Clays has secured funding for the virtual reality training equipment for the Kansas Highway Patrol. Just would there be any interest in reconsidering investigating that cooperative effort?
I don't have any. I think if he knew he had the financing, he should have told us 2 weeks ago. And it still sounds like a disconnect between his thoughts and the superintendent of the Highway Patrol. And I would lean more towards the superintendent's inclinations than someone in Topeka. That's just my personal opinion.
Did he say?
And KHP can use our facility. We'll be happy to let him in. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Did he say he had funding, or he was putting funding into next year's budget?
I don't want to characterize for Mr. Blanchard.
Come on up. Yeah, we need some clarification here, maybe.
Yeah, let me pull real quick. I've got 2% of my battery, so it's already on dim. Okay. So the question was, here it is. I put a Vertra simulator in the KHP budget that will be signed by the governor this week, identical to the one SPD is putting in their facility. Evidence, obviously, that he is able to get money into the budget, as he mentioned. And I asked him, is that in the 18 budget? And he says, yes, it will be purchased before July 1st. Said I was also able to get debt service on $300K a year for Troop B HQ headquartered in Topeka. The question isn't whether we can get the money, it's whether the money gets spent here or somewhere else. And then I said, well, thank you. I kind of felt that that's kind of what his comments were last week. And I mentioned earlier about the $250, the cost of the $350,000 for the simulator and so on. And just to be clear, the simulator money was $250,000. They'll likely use other funds to buy the accessories that will likely get closer to about $350,000. So sounds like it's likely to be signed by the governor this week for inclusion into the 2018 budget. And I don't believe that. I believe that that may have been something that he had initiated for Commissioner Davis after he was here. So it wouldn't have been something that he would have been aware of prior to 2 weeks ago at the meeting when he was here before.
Does KHP know they're getting this?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah.
And the space to erect it and...
It was, and I think he also had in there that if urgency were a problem, I think something could be, he said he felt something could most likely be worked out to provide training space for SPD with KHP.
Well, we could save KHP money, they can come use
Well, I
ours.
think I think his main concern, as was mine, and I think a couple of yours as well, was the fact that in tight budgets, when we start to duplicate services and duplicate equipment and duplicate other things, we're all paying twice for the same thing, and the question is whether you utilize those things to the extent where you need a second one, or if you're not even utilizing enough to need the full one itself. So
I'm trying to save the state $350,000.
Mr. Bingston, I'll ask you to guide me here, but I believe the procedure would be that someone that, if for a motion to reconsider, we'd need that motion made by someone that was on the affirming side last time.
Yes, if I may,
With the second?
Mayor, it's rule number 20, and if you don't mind me reading briefly, I think that'll be the fastest way to make sure everybody's on the same page as far as what your option might be. It says, when a vote has been taken, it shall be in order for any commissioner voting with the prevailing side to move a reconsideration thereof at the same or next regular meeting, but no question shall a second time be reconsidered at the same or next regular meeting. Beyond the next regular meeting, reconsideration of an item shall be governed by rule number 3. A motion for reconsideration must be seconded. However, the seconding can be done by any commissioner, regardless of how the seconding commissioner voted on the motion to be reconsidered. Approval of a motion for reconsideration requires only a majority vote, regardless of the vote necessary to adopt the motion to be reconsidered. The effect of the adoption of the motion to reconsider is to immediately place before the City Commission again the question on which the vote is to be reconsidered in the exact position it occupied the moment before it was voted on originally. In other words, the same motion, the motion that you enacted previously would be before you again.
And when you say immediately, you mean right at that meeting, right at that time?
Right. I think the concept is that it's not like everything's up for grabs. It's you're right back to the point before the vote was taken. So the motion that was before you when the original vote was taken is back before you. So any modification of that would require further amendment of that motion or whatever.
And that motion was to retain the training center in the 2017-18.
Yeah, the motion says moved by Commissioner Davis, seconded by Commissioner Hoppick to preserve the current 5-year capital improvement plan project status for the Police Department Training Center with all remaining project costs not to exceed $4.5 million, and to ask staff to work with the designer to provide alternate bid items. Let's see, I'll just read the minutes. Commissioner Hodges provided her thoughts on the motion. Commissioner Hay provided his thoughts on the project, waiting until 2020. Mayor Ryan called the question. Aye 3, nay 2. Hodges and Ryan were in the nay. Motion carried. So, so the...
So the question is, do one of those in the affirmative want to make a motion to reconsider?
So if we do not rescind this and we move on down the road, I mean, because what we've done now is we've agreed to keep this in the budget. So if we come to some kind of agreement with the Kansas Highway Patrol in 60 days to use their simulator, we would just adjust our plans on our current training facility. Would that be correct? Because ours is...
Well, yeah, the timing issue is that once you, quite honestly, once you solicit bids, you're really starting to obligate yourself a bit, because at least you're creating an expectation. You're not fully, truly obligated technically, but practically you start to obligate yourself to bidders who are going to spend a lot of time trying to put together a bid package and work for you so they can give you a good product. You're really more officially obligated. You are officially obligated once a bid is awarded and you enter into the contract for the construction. At that point, it's a little bit more difficult. There's typically some flexibility to amend your project, but generally speaking, there's not a lot. So you can't just play with that agreement with the contractor. That becomes an issue. So that really starts to lock you down. But there's a lot of things that could happen here. For example, the Highway Patrol could still choose to come use it. We could work out whether it's free, whether there's a fee or something like that. Now, they're larger than we are, so for a permanent facility, the scale is a question. Now, we don't know what the scale is, because scheduling can affect scale, right? You don't all have to use it at the same time. So we don't know what that is. So, but the point is when you have two agencies, you have a lot of things to work out. From a funding perspective, though, in all likelihood, we'd need to wait for the next, as we mentioned before, the next legislative session to see if they get funding. They don't really know how much funding to put in, because there's not even a feasibility on what the final product would look like. I'm not sure with the state how that would work, if they would just put in a number and hopefully it's enough and then we work through the feasibility and then into the design, or whether they put a number, they just do a project design kind of authorization and then we go to the next legislative session for construction. And I'm not sure. It's possible it could be either way. But to put in a number for the full project would be going in pretty blind. So, but even minimally, even the quickest process, if it goes in next legislative session, that's 2019, the funding wouldn't be available till the end of 2019. You're into a redesign, probably.
You're talking about a whole...
If that's a full partnership, you're into a redesign, and then you're probably into
about
future
the
construction. If it's a simulator, I mean, in this case, we wouldn't be obligated to purchase a simulator if, in fact, we had a partnership. You would have the room available, so it would, in all likelihood, with the timing, the space would be there, the building would be the same size, but you just wouldn't have a simulator in it. You'd have a partnership agreement in lieu of that.
But also remind you, the chief does not plan for the cost of the simulator to come out of that $4.5 million. He's using grants and private donations for that. So right now, no tax money would be used for that simulator.
Yeah, well, and there's
state or local.
Yeah, there's an assumption there that, first of all, that you're correct. There's a desire to apply for a grant to get that, and/or an option that we could look at to see if there would be any interest in private donations. If those all come through, then we have that. Now, I'll be honest with you, once you have something, you still have to maintain it and replace it. So there's always a cost, but the initial cost, that's how it's intended to be covered. If that doesn't work and the project comes in at $300,000 less than the budget, then you have the option of using the remaining budget to purchase that. So I would still think that's an active option to consider in the whole conversation as well, because we don't want to predict too much here.
And again, we know the Highway Patrol, if they get the funds, we still don't know. The sharing of the facility is still a concern. That
any time, whether it's public, private, you always have to work out the is it 50-50? Is it their facility and we share for a fee? Is it our facility and they share for a fee? How does that work? Scheduling, logistics. There's a lot of logistics. You just know you're going to take time to work those out. I'm not saying they can't be worked out at all, because we haven't even gotten far enough to know if there are any obstacles to that. There's going to be time in that. But quite honestly, in the funding cycle, there's time in there too. I mean, the quickest you're probably looking at that facility being constructed in that scenario would be, I'm speculating to say, construction season of 2020. If it takes a couple funding cycles, then obviously it's further out, but.
Any more conversation about this subject? We have a request for an executive session. Mr. Hunt, would you
I'm sorry.
like to do the honors for this?
How many minutes do we need for executive session?
Thank you. We were just discussing that. I think an hour would probably be best. And if I may, this might be the time to explain. We have two matters. You see that they are grouped together. And when I suggest an hour, that is in anticipation of dealing with both. We referred to the legislative changes that occurred a year ago. The League and more recently the Attorney General has opined that if you are dealing with subjects that are within the same justification, they can be grouped, and that's what we have suggested the approach you're taking with the combination of those two subjects, or just that both fall under the attorney-client privilege communications justification. So that's why we're able to group those, and that's why that's a combined time.
Okay. Mayor Ryan, I move the City Commission recess into executive session for 60 minutes to discuss the following two subjects. 1, negotiations relating to the terms of potential acquisition of the site for the South Water Treatment Plant and related appropriated water rights as an alternative to the pending eminent domain proceedings. 2, negotiations relating to the terms of potential future long-term leasing by the city to the county of the area within Kenwood Park, commonly known as the Expo Center, with legal counsel based upon the need for consultation with an attorney for the public body which would be deemed privilege in the attorney-client relationship pursuant to KSA 45-7319B2. The open meeting will resume in this room at 8:16.
Second.
Is there, it's been moved and seconded. Are we anticipating coming back?
We are not anticipating any action after the executive session.
And all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We'll move into executive session.